The wind caressed the dusty plains, while the shadows of the mountains were projected on a vast unknown landscape. They were lands loaded with stories, where the echoes of ancient civilization still whisper among forgotten ruins. In those days, long before the borders divided the dreams of men, the world was a mosaic of cultures that shone with an intensity that few can imagine. There was a beat on earth, a pulse that connected distant cities, majestic rivers, and infinite deserts. In the gloom of history, names arose that resonated strongly: Egypt, with their pyramids that challenged time; Mesopotamia, where Tigris and Euphrates rivers fed the first dreams of human greatness; the Indus Valley, with cities that kept secrets in its rectilinear streets; and China, tissue in silk and wrapped in the promise of empires to come. But among all these cultures, there was one that began to forge his own destiny, one that was still a murmur in the mountains of Zagros, Persia. Ancient history is not a linear story, it is a whirlwind of encounters, conflicts and alliances. Each civilization shone with its own light, but they were all connected by something bigger than themselves. The merchants were traveling through routes that crossed deserts and mountains, carrying not only spices and fabrics, but also ideas, beliefs and dreams. An Egyptian scroll could end in the hands of a Babylonian scribe, while a precious stone from India adorned the crown of an Assyrian king. There was a hunger to understand the world, to dominate it and, at the same time, preserve it. Persia, at that time, was nothing more than an unknown region for many. But its people, the Aryans, carried a spark that seemed to turn on a larger fire. They were nomads, warriors, and dreamers, molded by the mountains and the valleys that surround them. In those hard lands, they learned the importance of the community, loyalty, and strength. Their stories talked about heroes, gods who walked among men, and a destiny that awaited beyond the stars. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the pharaohs raised temples and pyramids that reflected their desire for eternity. The Nile waters dictated the rhythm of life, offering abundance but also imposing respect. In Mesopotamia, the first city stood flourished, protected by walls that not only kept the enemies out, but also locked the hope of an eternal order. Babylon, Ur, Nineveh, names that evoke both glory and destruction. The Indus Valley, with its mysterious writing and careful cities, seemed to breathe an air of calm, but also hid its own enigmas. Who were those civilization builders that seemed to disappear without a trace? And to the east, in the fertile plains of China, dynasties emerged with a clear vision: the mandate of heaven granted power, but could also snatch it. The ancient world was an ambition theater, but also wonders. Imagine caravans crossing deserts under starry skies, carrying not only merchandise, but also stories of distant lands. The stories of kings and warriors, of gods and demons, were counted in bustling markets and before solitary fires. There was a tacit understanding, everything was connected, and every culture, every town, played a role in the great drama of existence. And it was in this scenario where Persia began to rise, first as a whisper, then as a roar that would shake the foundations of neighboring civilizations. They were not the richest, nor the most technologically advanced, but they had something that the other powers underestimated: an unwavering will to unite what was divided. Persia did not seek to only conquer, sought to transcend, and in that search he would forge the first truly multicultural empire in the ancient world. History is never static. It is like a river that flows, which changes course with each obstacle, which grows with each tributary. And in that flow, Persia prepared to become more than a town between mountains. It was time to get out of the shadows and claim their place under the sun. Ciro el Grande's days were still far away, but the seeds were already planted, waiting for the right time to bloom. From the desert sands to the Indo-Green hills, the world watched without knowing it, while Persia took his first breath, ready to change everything. But before his name became an echo that resonated through the centuries, something else happened in neighboring lands. Something that would ignite conflict and transformation sparks, marking the way for a future that no one could stop. The fresh air of the mountains wrapped travelers while they rose in unknown lands, guided only by the force of their instinct and the incessant brightness of the stars. They were a wandering town, with looks full of determination and firm steps on a land that seemed to whisper ancient stories under their feet. They were called the Aryans, children of the wind and the plains, bearers of a legacy that they still did not know that it would be immortal. They came from afar, from a place that words could not describe clearly. Its history was not written in stones or parchments, but in the collective memory of songs and stories transmitted from generation to generation. They said that they were descendants of the heavens, that their strength came from the gods, and that their destiny was intertwined with the mountains, valleys, and vast plains that they now called home. The Iranian plateau extended before them as a promise and a challenge. It was an imposing land, where the days were burning and the frost nights, where the rivers serpent cautiously and the mountains rose as silent guardians. For the Aryans, it was not just a place to inhabit, it was a land that should be conquered with effort, a place that should be molded by his hands. Every step they took closer to that new identity that was about to be born. They were warriors and shepherds, artisans and visionaries. His world revolved around their families and clans, united by the blood and for an ancestral oath of mutual protection. Their animals were their greatest treasure, not only because they were supported, but because they represented the connection between the human and the divine. The horses, in particular, were sacred, animals of strength and freedom, capable of taking them beyond any horizon. But the Aryans were not just men and women who survived the day-to-day. They were dreamers with a deep respect for the cosmic order. In his beliefs, the world was divided between light and darkness, good and evil, pure and corrupt. For them, life was a constant battle to maintain balance, and that struggle was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the spirit. This value system would shape, centuries later, to the faith that would guide them, Zoroastrianism. The language they spoke was like a cordless, fluid and powerful river, carrying with them the essence of their culture. It was the Proto-Indo-Europeo, a language that would be the root of many others in the future, but that at that time united the Aryans as a single people. Through their words, they built links, honored their ancestors, and shaped the world that surrounded them. In those days, the earth was not empty. The Aryans found other peoples on their way, cultures that had already thrown roots in the fertile plains and in the protected valleys. Some welcomed them curious, others with suspicion. But the Aryans had a unique ability to adapt. They learned, traded and, in some cases, conquered. They did not do it for cruelty, but because they felt that the earth itself called them to take their place. Over time, the clans began to join under strong leaders, men who were not only warriors, but also wise. These leaders did not seek only power, they were looking for something bigger, unity. Because they understood that true strength did not reside in weapons or numbers, but in the ability to act as a whole. Thus the idea of Persia was born, not as a name, but as a vision, a land where the Aryans could prosper together, protected by the mountains and guided by the stars. The first villages began to emerge in the fertile valleys, built with adobe and stone. They were modest, but in their hearts the dream of something bigger was beaten. The families worked together, cultivating the earth and taking care of their animals, while the elders told stories around the fire. Stories of heroes who had crossed deserts, of gods who had given gifts to men, of a future where Persia would be a lighthouse for the world. As time progressed, the Aryans began to divide into two large groups. Some remained in the Zagros Mountains, becoming the Medes, a strong and proud people. Others descended towards the plains, where they took the name of Persians. Although they were still brothers, their paths began to bifurcate, and with it new stories, new rivalries, and new alliances emerged. The sun was put on the Iranian plateau, staining the sky of a deep red while the shadows of the mountains lengthened. At that time, no one could foresee what was to come. No one could imagine that those wandering peoples, hardened by the mountains and united by their faith, were destined to change the course of history. But Persia's formation was not yet complete. The foundations were there, strong like the rock itself, but the spark was missing, the leader who could light the fire of an empire. And while the night he covered the plains with his mantle of stars, fate began to draw his plan. Because in a corner of those mountains, in a small Persian clan, a child would be born whose name would resonate forever, Cyrus. The mountains of the Zagros, with their irregular and deep valleys, kept the secrets of a divided people, but with intertwined destinations. The Medes and Persians shared a common blood, a language that sprouted from the same origin and a reverence by the same gods. However, during generations, they had been two different branches of the same tree, each fighting to survive in a relentless land. The Medes ruled with strength and cunning from the north, while the Persians, more humble, worked the lands to the south, dreaming with a larger future. The Medes had established a powerful kingdom, imposing their authority on the surrounding territories. His kings ruled from the strength of Ecbatana, a city that shone with the promise of stability and control. Under its walls, caravans loaded with goods traveled by routes that connected the east with the west. His domain seemed impenetrable, and the Persians, although independent in spirit, accepted their place as vassals. But under the surface, the balance was precarious, and the thread that sustained the power of the Medes was about to break. In the south, the Persians lived in clans, each led by a boss who represented the pride and strength of his people. Although politically divided, they shared a dream: to free their land from foreign domain and create a kingdom where their identity was not a shadow under the Med domain. Among them there was a young leader who watched with acute eyes, learning from the mistakes and strengths of those around him. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus was not a common leader. From a young age, it showed an unusual mixture of humility and ambition. He was someone who walked among his people with the same simplicity with whom he faced his enemies. There was something in him that inspired confidence, not only for his skill on the battlefield, but for his ability to join hearts. In a world where brute force often dictated fate, Cyrus understood that true power resided in unity. At that time, the Medes faced their own problems. The authority of King Astyages began to crumble under the weight of his arrogance and his inability to maintain the loyalty of his vassals. The provinces stirred, and the respect that once surrounded it was transformed into resentment. It was a moment of weakness, and Cyrus saw him as an opportunity. But the challenge was not just military. To overthrow the Medes, Cyrus needed more than swords and archers. He needed the will of his people, united under a cause that was bigger than any clan or family. Thus, he began to speak not only of freedom, but of a shared destination. He talked about a kingdom where there would be no Medes or Persians, but a single powerful nation. His words caught as a fire in the dry grass. When Persian troops marched against Astyages, it wasn't just a revolt, it was a revolution. The Medes, tired of their king's despotism, began to defect, joining Cyrus's forces. It was not a bloody conquest or an endless battles chain. It was as if the world was destined to bend before Cyrus's vision. The old king was overthrown, and with him the separation that had existed between Media and Persians fell. Cyrus did not limit himself to claiming the throne. In an act of political audacity, he integrated the Medes into their nascent empire. He did not treat them as defeated enemies, but as allies. He respected his traditions, his leaders, and their culture, creating a government model that would be the basis of an empire as never seen before. The ancient rivals were now one, united under a king who did not seek to be a tyrant, but a protector. The rise of the Media and the Persians was not a simple political unification, it was the creation of something new. Cyrus had forged a common identity in a world where ethnic and cultural differences used to be a reason for conflict. The Medes and the Persians now shared a flag, a destination, and a dream, an empire that would not only dominate their enemies, but also bring order and justice to a divided world. But Cyrus was not a man who formed the victory. While the mountains of the Zagros watched in silence, their thoughts were already on the horizon, in the lands beyond their borders, in the kingdoms that still did not know their name. Because for him, the unification of Media and Persians was just the beginning of something bigger. Something that would change the course of history forever. The wind of the plain seemed to whisper its name even before men shouted in battle. Cyrus. A man whose destiny was not limited to leading a people, but to transforming the world. Since his birth, there were extraordinary go in him, something that separated him from others, although in his early years it was nothing more than a Persian child between mountains and valleys. The story of Cyrus el Grande is not just that of a conqueror, it is the story of a man who imagined what no one before dared to dream, at an empire where diversity was not an obstacle, but a strength. His youth was marked by the simplicity of life among the Persians, but the legends say that even as a child he had an indomitable spirit. Some versions of his history say he was sent away by fear of a prophecy that he warned that he would overthrow his grandfather, Astyages, the king of the Medes. Raised among common people, learned to value loyalty, justice, and strength of character. When it was time to claim what was his, Cyrus did not do it with anger or cruelly, but with the certainty that he was fulfilling an inevitable destiny. His first great conquest was to unify the Medes and Persians, but that victory was not the end of his ambition. It was just the beginning. Under their leadership, the Persians ceased to be an isolated group on the Iranian plateau and became the spark that would turn on the creation of an empire. Cyrus was not a king who simply ruled from afar. He led from the front, walked next to his soldiers, and treated his allies as the same. That was his true strength, his ability to inspire loyalty not only for fear, but for respect. His military campaigns were fast and decisive, but always marked by a different approach from other conquerors. When he directed his attention to Babylon, he not only sought to submit it, but to integrate it into his vision of an inclusive empire. Babylon was not a bloodbath, but an act of ingenuity and strategy. Cyrus, when taking the city in 539 BC, not only defeated King Nabonidus, but also won the favor of the local population by releasing slaves, including communities such as the Jews, who saw him as a liberator. His famous statement, known as Cyrus's Cylinder, is considered by many as the first example of human rights in history. In it, Cyrus proclaimed his commitment to freedom of religion and respect for the cultures and traditions of the peoples that integrated their empire. It was not simply a political gesture, it was the expression of his vision of a world where diversity was protected, not crushed. The conquered peoples did not see him as an oppressor, but as a protector, a king who understood that true greatness is not to destroy, but in building. Cyrus did not stop in Babylon. His armies marched east, ensuring the lands of the current Afghanistan and even the borders of India. To the north, he submitted mountainous regions that other kings would have considered impossible to dominate. To the west, he extended his influence to Anatolia, defeating the powerful kingdom of Lydia and capturing the legendary King Craso. But even in victory, Cyrus showed mercy. According to the stories, he did not humiliate Craso, but treated him with dignity, demonstrating that a great leader not only conquers territories, but also hearts. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus, was not a set of random conquered territories. It was a carefully designed system to last. Cyrus understood that he could not govern such a vast empire alone, so he established an administrative structure that allowed each region to maintain some autonomy, always under the supervision of the central government. The satrapas, or regional governors, were responsible for administering justice, raising taxes, and maintaining peace, but also had the duty to respect local customs and laws. This balance between central control and local autonomy was one of the keys to the success of the empire. Despite his military and political genius, Cyrus was not immune to the dangers that stalk any great leader. His life ended in mysterious circumstances, probably in battle against a nomadic tribe northeast of his empire. Although his death was tragic, his legacy was assured. The empire that built not only survived his departure, but also flourished under his successors. In the city of Parsing, Cyrus built its capital and, later, its grave. Unlike the great monuments of other kings, his grave was simple, almost humble, but his presence was powerful. Even in death, Cyrus seemed to say that his true greatness was not in gold or stones, but in the hearts of those whom he had governed. The Achaemenid of Cyrus not only changed the map of the ancient world, changed the way men understood power, justice, and governance. His life and his conquests marked the beginning of an era in which the strength and diplomacy walked hand in hand, where an empire was not built with fear, but with hope. But although Cyrus rest Arbar in his grave, the empire he left behind still had a lot to tell. Because what he began, others would continue, leading his dream beyond what even he could have imagined. The fire burned high on the altar, a flame that seemed to challenge the time and oblivion. Surrounded by the songs of the priests and the aroma of the incense, the fire was not just an element, it was a symbol, a connection between the earthly and the divine. For the ancient Persians, that flame represented something bigger than themselves, the eternal struggle between good and evil, between light and darkness. In the heart of his culture, a powerful and unique faith was beaten, Zoroastrismo. At a time when men sought meaning in the gods of heaven, earth, and rivers, a prophet arose that would transform the way the Persians understood the world. His name was Zarathustra, known in the West as Zoroaster. According to legends, Zarathustra was not a common man. From a young age, his thoughts seemed to travel beyond the daily concerns of mortals. I was looking for answers to deep questions. Why does suffering exist? What is good? What is evil? And, above all, what is the purpose of life? One day, while walking near a river, Zarathustra had a vision that would change his life and that of his people. Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom and light, appeared to him. In that revelation, Zarathustra understood that the world was divided into two forces, good, represented by Ahura Mazda, and evil, embodied by Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. But this fight was not an external battle, it was a conflict that was fought within each human being. Zarathustra's message was revolutionary. He preached that each person had the freedom to choose between good and evil, between truth and lies, between light and darkness. This concept of free will was radical in a world where many believed that the fate of men was in the hands of capricious gods. For the followers of Zarathustra, the purpose of life was not simply to survive, but to live according to three fundamental principles: good thoughts, good words, and good actions. Zoroastrismo was not limited to being a religion, it was a worldview that impregnated all aspects of Persian life. Light and fire were its most sacred symbols, representing the purity and presence of Ahura Mazda. In each temple of fire, the priests maintained an eternal flame, fed day and night as a reminder of the divine presence. But the fire was not worshipped, he was revered as a means to communicate with the Creator. The impact of Zoroastrism on Persian culture was deep. The Persians saw the world as a creation of Ahura Mazda, something that should be careful and respected. Nature was not something that could be exploited without consequences, it was a sacred gift. This respect for the environment was reflected in its agricultural practices, in the construction of its cities, and in the way they interacted with the earth. The idea of justice was also deeply rooted in religion. The Persian kings, starting with Cyrus the Great, looked at themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda to govern with wisdom and justice. The king was not just a ruler, he was a protector, a balance in the world. This vision influenced the way the Persians treated the conquered peoples. Instead of imposing their faith by force, they allowed local cultures and religions to flourish, provided they did not threaten the established order. Zoroastrismo also influenced Persian festivities and traditions. One of the most important celebrations was the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which coincided with the spring equinox. This feast not only marked the beginning of a new agricultural cycle, but also spiritual renewal. During the Nowruz, the families gathered, lit fires and shared meals, reaffirming their commitment to light and good. But the struggle between good and evil was not just a metaphor for the Persians. They believed that each action had an impact on that cosmic balance. Good actions strengthened light, while selfish and evil acts fed darkness. This sense of individual responsibility created a society where ethics and morals were not only personal issues, but fundamental pillars of community life. As Zoroastrismo spread, its influence extended beyond the borders of the Persian Empire. Some academics argue that their ideas influenced other later religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Concepts such as free will, the final judgment, and the struggle between good and evil have notable parallels in these traditions. However, Zoroastrismo was not simply a static belief system. It was a live force, adapting and evolving over time. Despite the challenges it would face in later centuries, the flame that Zarathustra ignited never went out at all. The ancient Persians, with their respect for the light and their commitment to the truth, left a legacy that continues to shine, even in the darkest corners of history. And while the stars illuminated Persia's nights, men and women looked at the sky, knowing that every choice they made, every act of goodness, was another step in the eternal struggle for light. The golden sands of the desert reflected a relentless sun, while the Persian army advanced towards a destination that would change the story. It was the year 525 BC, and Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, led a campaign that would resonate as one of the boldest exploits of his time, the conquest of Egypt. The Persians, accustomed to the mountains and plains of their homeland, faced a strange and challenging landscape. But in the eyes of Cambyses, there was no place for doubt. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, with their majestic pyramids and its eternal river, the Nile, was its goal. Cambyses was not a common leader. He had inherited the throne after his father's death, and with him, the responsibility of maintaining and expanding the vast empire that Cyrus had built. But Cambyses not only wanted to preserve his father's legacy, he wanted to record his own name on the pages of history. Egypt, with its rich culture and abundant resources, represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The road to Egypt was not easy. Persian armies had to cross the abrasive arenas of the Sinai Desert, a treacherous terrain where life depended on the water they carried. It is said that local nomads, knowledgeable about desert secrets, helped the Persians draw safe routes and find hidden oases. This act of pragmatism and adaptation would be key in the Cambyses campaign. On the other side of the desert, the Psamtik pharaoh III ruled Egypt. Although young, Psamtik was not naive. He knew that Persian advance was a direct threat to his kingdom, and had tried to look for allies among the Greek states. However, divisions between Greek city-states prevented a coordinated response. Egypt was only in front of the Persian military machine. The final confrontation took place in Pelusium, a strategic city near the mouth of the Nile. The Battle of Pelusium was not only a clash of armies, but a meeting of cultures, of two very different worlds that now collided with violence. Persian troops, superior in number and better organized, defeated the Egyptians with a forcefulness that left the kingdom of pharaohs staggering. It is said that Cambyses, in an act of psychological cunning, used sacred images for the Egyptians, such as cats and other animals associated with their deities, as part of their strategy. Egyptian soldiers, fearful of damaging these sacred animals, hesitated in their resistance, which allowed the Persians to advance with less opposition. Although this anecdote is stained with myth, it illustrates how Cambyses understood that war was not only fought with swords, but also with symbols. After the victory in Pelusium, Cambyses marched to Memphis, the capital of Egypt, where he captured the Psamtik III pharaoh and consolidated his control over the kingdom. But Cambyses did not limit himself to conquer, he also sought to integrate into the political and cultural structure of Egypt. Pharaoh proclaimed himself, adopting the titles and symbols of Egyptian royalty. For many Egyptians, this was a blow to their pride, but also an effective tactic to stabilize the territory under Persian domain. Despite his military success, Cambyses was not seen as a compassionate ruler. Historical sources, especially those of Greek historians like Herodotus, paint an image of a cruel and uncontrolled man. He is accused of sacrilegious acts, such as the desecration of temples and the humiliation of Egyptian traditions. However, these stories should be seen with caution, since they often come from hostile sources to the Persian Empire. What is clear is that Cambyses was a leader who did not hesitate to use force to consolidate his authority. The conquest of Egypt marked an important milestone in the history of the Persian Empire. With this victory, Cambyses had expanded the borders of Persia to North Africa, ensuring control over one of the oldest and most rich civilizations in the world. But this expansion also brought new challenges. Governing such a diverse territory required not only military force, but also political and diplomatic ability, something that Cambyses, unlike his father, seemed to lack some aspects. As Cambyses consolidated his power in Egypt, rumors of rebellion began to emerge in other parts of the empire. Irons foreshadowed an uncertain future for the kingdom that Cyrus had founded. However, at that time, Cambyses was at the top of his power, contemplating the Nile, the river that for centuries had been the spine of Egypt, now under its control. While the stars shone on the desert horizon, Cambyses should know that the conquest was just the beginning. The real challenge would be to keep an empire together that now extended from the coast of the Mediterranean to the doors of India. And although the world could admire his audacity, he also began to wonder if Cambyses was the leader who could sustain such immense legacy, or if his ambitions would take him to his downfall. The dawn light bathed the hills of Persia, revealing a vast and diverse empire, a work that seemed to challenge the limits of the possible. In the heart of this gigantic mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions was Darius I, a man whose name would resonate as a synonym for order, innovation, and vision. He was not a conqueror in the style of Cyrus or Cambyses. Its greatness was not measured in territories won in battle, but in how it transformed an empire into a perfectly engaged machine. Darius did not reach the throne by direct inheritance, but by determination. After the death of Cambyses, the empire faced a crisis: false suitors, rebellions, and chaos threatened to dismember what Cyrus had built. Dario, backed by his military cunning and the Persian nobility, managed to claim the crown, but his real challenge began after the weapons were silenced. Governing such a vast empire was not a task that could be achieved alone. He required a brilliant administrative mind, and Dario had it. One of Dario's first reforms was to divide the empire into provinces called satrapia. Each of these regions, governed by a satrap, maintained a certain degree of local autonomy, but was subject to a rigorous central control. Dario understood that to guarantee loyalty and order, it was necessary to balance regional freedom with imperial supervision. The satraps not only administered justice and raised taxes, but also regularly informed the king. To avoid abuse of power, Dario instituted a system of inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king, who were traveling through the empire ensuring that the satraps would rule with justice. The economy was another pillar of his government. Before Dario, the tax system was chaotic, with irregular payments and in species, such as cattle or grain. Dario established a uniform tax system that depended on the economic capacities of each region. This not only ensured stable income for the empire, but also encouraged equity. Some regions, such as Egypt, contributed gold, while others, such as Babylon, offered agricultural resources. But Dario's genius was not limited to tax reforms. He understood that an empire of that magnitude needed infrastructure to connect its vast territories. Thus the Royal Road was born, a network of roads that extended from Sardes, in the west, to Susa, in the east. This corridor of more than 2,700 kilometers not only facilitated the rapid movement of troops, but also revolutionized trade and communications. The royal messengers, mounted on fast horses, could cross the empire in a matter of days, bringing orders from the king to the most remote corners. Trade flourished under Dario as never before. For the first time, the empire adopted a standard currency, the daric, made of pure gold. This currency not only simplified transactions, but also encouraged the exchange between the regions of the empire and beyond. Persian markets were filled with exotic goods, spices of India, wine from Anatolia, ivory of Africa, and textiles of Mesopotamia. Under Dario's reign, Persia was not only a military empire, but an economic bridge between the east and west. But Dario's vision went beyond the practical. He also had an eye for symbolic greatness. In Persepolis, he ordered the construction of a city that reflected the majesty of the empire. His palace, with his imposing columns and detailed reliefs, was not simply a real residence, it was a monument to Persian power and the diversity of its peoples. Each delegation that arrived in Persepolis to pay tribute was represented in the sculptures of its walls, a reminder that this empire was not a set of submitted territories, but a coalition of cultures under a single flag. Religion also played a crucial role in its administration. Although Dario was a devoted follower of Zoroastrism, he did not impose his faith on the conquered peoples. Instead, it allowed each region to practice their religion and maintain its traditions. This pragmatic approach helped reduce tensions and consolidate the loyalty of peoples to the Persian throne. However, Dario's reign was not exempt from challenges. In the last years of his government, he directed an ambitious campaign towards Greece, a territory that seemed small compared to the Persian Empire, but that would turn out to be a formidable adversary. The defeat in the Marathon battle was an unexpected blow to a man accustomed to success, but did not overshadow the magnitude of his achievements. Dario was more than a king, he was a visionary who understood that the strength of an empire does not lie only in his armies, but in his ability to create a sustainable order. Through its administrative reforms, its impulse for infrastructure and its ability to unite diverse peoples under a central government, Dario transformed Persia into a true superpower of the ancient world. And while Persepolis's lights shone under the starry sky, Dario should know that his legacy was not only stone and gold, but the very idea that an empire could be more than conquers, it could be a home for millions of souls. A home that, despite the evidence they would face, would remain standing as a testimony of their greatness. The desert wind carried rumors of such a vast empire that seemed to challenge the limits of the known world. From the mountains of the Zagros to the shores of the Indo, from the Aegean Sea to the arenas of the Egyptian desert, the Persian Empire was an amalgam of cultures, languages, and landscapes. Governing such a colossal entity was not just a matter of military force, it required an administration system that could maintain order without crushing diversity. That system was the brightest creation of Persians, satrapia. The concept of satrapia was not a whim, but a need born of the vast extension of the empire. Each conquered region brought not only new territories, but also traditions, laws, and expectations. The Persians, led by Darius I, understood that a centralized and rigid government would be a failure in such a heterogeneous empire. Instead, they adopted strategic decentralization that not only maintained control, but also respected local peculiarities. Each satrapia was, in essence, a mini-reino within the empire. Governed by a satrap, or governor, this subdivision had the responsibility of administering justice, raising taxes, and maintaining order. The satraps were not simply administrators, they were the eyes, ears, and hands of the king in his region. Although they enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy, their power was strictly guarded to avoid abuse or insurrections. To control this decentralized power network, Darius established a system that combined confidence with control. The eyes and ears of the king, a group of loyal inspectors to the throne, toured the satrapia collecting information and reporting directly to the monarch. His presence was silent but constant, a reminder that the king's power even reached the most remote corners of the empire. The diversity of each satrapia was both a strength and a challenge. In Anatolia, the population spoke Greek and practiced local religions. In Babylon, the ancient Mesopotamian traditions were still alive. In Egypt, the pharaohs had left a deeply rooted legacy in the soul of the people. Despite these differences, satrapies operated under a common framework that guaranteed the cohesion of the empire. The taxes, established according to the economic capacities of each region, were an example of this balance. Instead of imposing impossible quotas, Darius allowed each satrapia to contribute proportionally, ensuring both economic stability and loyalty. The satrapia system not only served to manage, but also to connect. Through the royal road, satrapias were not isolated islands, but interconnected nodes in a network that facilitated trade, communication, and troop movement. A messenger who started from Susa could reach Sardes in a matter of days, carrying orders, news, or reports. This constant flow of information and resources kept the heart of the empire alive. The construction of this system was not simple or immediate. It required a deep understanding of local cultures and diplomacy that balanced central power with regional autonomy. The Persians were not content to govern by force, they learned to integrate. They allowed local traditions to persist, provided they did not threaten the general order. This flexibility not only pacified the conquered regions, but also turned its inhabitants into active participants in the empire. However, the satrapia system was not exempt from risk. The satraps, with their power and resources, could become rivals of the throne if they were not closely monitored. Along the years, there were attempts to rebellion, conspiracies, and betrayals, but the general structure of the system proved to be solid enough to resist these challenges. The supervision and autonomy mixture created a delicate but effective balance. The true genius of satrapia was based on their ability to adapt. Each of them was a dynamic entity, capable of responding to both local needs and the demands of the empire. This governance model not only allowed the stability of the Persian Empire for generations, but also left a legacy that would influence future political systems, from the Hellenistic empires to the Roman administration. On the quiet nights of Persepolis, Darius had to look at the stars and reflect on the monumental achievement he had built. Satrapies were not just territorial divisions, they were a will to the human capacity to find order in diversity. Under his leadership, a mosaic of peoples and cultures became a living organism, where each part worked in harmony with the whole. And while the eternal fire burned in the Zoroastrian temples, symbolizing the light and truth, the satrapies were maintained as the invisible pillar that supported the vast empire, joining millions of people under one authority, but respecting the differences that defined them. The first ray of dawn illuminated the hills of the Iranian plateau, revealing a wonder that seemed to emerge from the greatest dreams. Persepolis, the city of the kings, was majestic, a testimony of the ambition, vision, and power of the Persian Empire. Under Darius I's gaze, this city was not only a political capital, but a living symbol of the greatness and diversity of an empire that covered continents. The choice of the place for Persepolis was not accidental. In the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, far from the commercial and military routes, Dario found a place that represented stability and permanence. Here, in a region surrounded by imposing nature, the construction of what would become the spiritual and ceremonial heart of the empire began. More than a functional city, Persepolis was a scenario carefully designed to impress, a place where architecture spoke the language of power. The first stones were placed with almost divine precision. The artisans from all over the empire, from Egypt to India, worked together in this monumental work, bringing with them styles and techniques of their native lands. Each chiseled in the stone, each carved relief, carried with them the essence of the cultures that were part of the empire. Persepolis was not just Persian, it was a mirror of the known world, where every detail remembered that this city belonged to all and no one at the same time. The Great Terrace of Persepolis, carved directly in the rock, was the core of the city. There the most important buildings rose, surrounded by a system of walls that protected the complex of any threat. However, Persepolis was never a strength. There were no massive defensive walls or surveillance towers. Its purpose was not to resist sieges, but inspire astonishment. The city was designed to last not as a military bulwark, but as an eternal testimony of Persian glory. Access to the terrace was marked by the Door of All Nations, an imposing structure flanked by winged bulls with human heads, symbolic guardians of power and wisdom. When passing through this door, visitors immersed themselves in a world where each step was loaded with meaning. The reliefs that adorned the walls represented delegations from all parts of the empire, carrying taxes to the king. These figures, carefully sculpted, did not show submission, but mutual respect. Each face, every outfit, told a history of unity in diversity. The center of Persepolis was the Apadana, the most impressive audience room of the complex. With columns that rose as giant trees towards heaven, the Apadana was a place where the king received emissaries, noble and leaders from all regions of the empire. Here, under a roof that seemed to challenge gravity, Dario and his successors presented themselves not as tyrants, but as leaders of a unified world. Each word pronounced in this room resonated not only on the stone walls, but in the hearts of the thousands living under the Persian banner. Persepolis was not only a place of ceremonies, it was also a declaration of principles. Each building, from the private palaces to the stores, was decorated with reliefs that showed scenes of harmony and cooperation. The stone carvings showed not only the magnificence of the king, but also the work of the peoples who kept the empire alive. There was no war or oppression in these images, just an ideal of coexistence and shared prosperity. Persepolis's symbolism extended beyond its architecture. The gardens that surrounded the city, known as paradis, were a reflection of paradise according to Zoroastrismo, the predominant religion of the Persians. These green spaces, carefully designed, were a reminder of the connection between man, nature, and the divine. In the holidays, when the delegations of the entire empire met in Persepolis, these gardens were filled with life, joining people from different cultures under the same sky. However, Persepolis was not just a place of celebrations, it was also a deposit of wealth and the treasures of the empire. Their warehouses housed gold, silver, and precious objects brought from the furthest corners of the Persian world. These treasures were not only a symbol of opulence, but also of the trust that the regions had in the central power. Here, under the supervision of real officials, the fruits of millions were kept. Persepolis's legacy cannot be separated from its tragic end. Decades after its construction, the city would be burned by Alexander the Great, an act that some consider retaliation and others, a gesture of hatred towards an empire that once dominated the world. However, even among the flames, Persepolis's foundations resisted. Its ruins, even today, tell the history of a civilization that understood that true power does not reside in the conquest, but in the ability to unite and endure. While the sun put on the Zagros Mountains, Persepolis's shadows lengthened, as if the city itself seemed to reach infinity. And although time has eroded its walls and columns, the spirit of Persepolis is still alive, reminding us that the greatness of an empire is not measured only in its victories, but in its ability to dream and build something that transcends the centuries. The murmur of the wind toured the vast rooms of Persepolis, where, between very high columns and tapestries that reflected the colors of the empire, the Achaemenid court gathered. The atmosphere was loaded with rituals, symbolism, and power. The great king, the supreme ruler of the Persian Empire, was not only the military and political leader of millions of souls, but also a man surrounded by a court that represented the best and the highest of an ancient world full of complexities. In this court, the rules of the label and diplomacy were as important as the strength of the armies. The king was not simply an earthly monarch, it was the central figure of a cosmos where divine power was closely intertwined with the human. The court not only served to govern, but also to maintain and express the divine connection. The ceremonies were the language of power, and in them, every movement, every gesture, carried a deep meaning. The great king, under the title of Shahan Shah, was considered the absolute sovereign, but this power was not exercised in isolation. Beside him, a nearby circle of nobles, officers, and counselors formed the elite that helped govern the empire. Often, these men were from various satrapia, reflecting the amplitude and diversity of peoples under Persian domain. The closest to the king were known as the nobles of the court, and their presence in the ceremonies of the court was an affirmation of the legitimacy of the reign. Among them was the Great Vizier, the second in command, who had the task of ensuring the administration of the empire and was responsible for directing day-to-day affairs. But the court was not just a political decision-making space, it was also an art center, culture, and magnificence. The banquets, celebrations, and rituals were part of the day-to-day, and each of these acts was a carefully orchestrated show. During the great festivals, for example, the king received ambassadors of the most remote nations of the empire and beyond. Often, the court was crowded with exotic wealth brought from the confines of Asia and Africa, showing the world that Persian power was unlimited. Religious ceremonies were equally important in the Achaemenid court. The Zoroastrian rituals, which talked about the struggle between light and darkness, were deeply rooted in the daily life of the court. The fire, a symbol of purity and divinity, was kept alive in the palace, and it was said that the king, as a spiritual leader of the people, should embody light and truth. In each religious holiday, the king and his court made sacrifices, prayers, and rituals that reinforced the idea that the divine order was manifested through his leadership. The courtiers, of course, had to live up to their king's magnificence. Clothing, behavior, and language were of vital importance. Each member of the court owed to follow strict tag codes, especially during banquets and receptions. The most important guests could sit near the king, while the others were distributed in seats according to their status. The food and drink, served in gold and silver dishes, were consumed in an ostentatious environment, but also of respect. The wine flowed, but never in excess. Courtesy was essential, and discussions or disagreements should never be altered before the king's eyes. The king, on the other hand, not only ruled from absolute power, but also embodied the balance between authority and wisdom. During the hearings, his word was law. Those who wanted to consult the king, whether foreign subjects or visitors, had to undergo rigorous protocols. The messages had to be delivered with respect, often with a position of humility in the presence of the monarch. Even foreign delegations, however powerful they were, understood that the Persian king not only represented a government, but the center of a tradition and a culture that was considered the largest in the world. Within the court, the king's council was essential for decision-making. Although the power of the great king was absolute, he could not govern without the support of his closest circle. The wise, experts in law, strategy, and administration, played a crucial role, offering advice and helping in the resolution of conflicts within the empire. However, although the nobles of the court had considerable weight, the ultimate power was still in the hands of the king. The relationship between the sovereign and his nobles was complex, marked by mutual respect, but also by constant surveillance about loyalties. In addition to politics and administration, the court was also a place where culture was cultivated. The poets, musicians, and artists were welcome in the great celebrations, and the Persian court became a center where the arts flourished. Persian poetry, in particular, was celebrated in these spaces, and the verses of great poets, such as those who wrote about the heroism of the great kings and ancestral myths, were recited with great enthusiasm. Among the most prominent rituals were the reception of foreign ambassadors. The protocol was so meticulous that even the words that were pronounced during these events were strictly defined. The ambassadors not only delivered taxes, but also testimony of respect for the king, which strengthened the image of Persia as the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. On the quiet nights of Persepolis, while the brightness of the fire illuminated the great rooms of the palace, the great king and his court prepared for another day of government, where luxury, politics and religion mixed in a host of ceremonies that they demonstrated the permanence and magnificence of the Persian monarchy. In this world of opulence, where the ritual and wisdom joined, the great king and his court were the soul and the engine of an empire that seemed eternal. The first breezes of the war blew east of Greece, where the city-states lived their separate, but extremely competitive existence. In Persia, on the other hand, the empire extended through vast territories, a superpower whose power seemed unattainable, whose wealth overflowed and whose army was feared throughout the ancient world. This vast Persian machinery began to turn to the west, when King Darius I put his eyes on Greek cities. What seemed a simple step towards expansion would be transformed into one of the most emblematic clashes in history, a medical wars. It was 490 BC. And the Persian Empire was at its peak. Darius I, recognized for his intelligence and strategic ability, wanted to ensure his dominance over the Greek cities that were on the Aegean Sea coast, just at the edge of their expansion. The reason behind the invasion was not only strategic, but also personal. Some of the Greek cities, such as Athens, had rebelled against their influence, and those insubordinations were unacceptable for a king who considered the supreme authority of all known land. A rebel, as Darius thought, should be crushed to ensure peace and stability within his empire. The tension grew while the Persians, with their army of thousands of men, advanced towards Greece. The Persian army was incomparable in its size and organization, with archers, cavalry, and a formidable terrestrial force. In the other corner, the Greek cities, divided between them, could not imagine that the Persians would go so far. However, fate had other intentions. The first important clash occurred in the Marathon Plain, in 490 BC. A Persian army led by General Darius found a much smaller Greek force, but fiercely determined. The Greeks, mainly Athenians, understood that this would be a confrontation with life or death. Marathon not only represented the defense of its territory, but also the preservation of its identity and freedom before the Persian threat. That confrontation had been created in the air, and when the dust settled on the Marathon plains, the Greeks, with their cunning, courage and an ingenious strategy, they rose as winners. The battle was an overwhelming victory for the Athenians, who managed to repel a numerically superior Persian army. The Persians, although powerful and well organized, had not anticipated the fierce determination of the Greeks. Marathon's victory was, for the Greeks, more than a military victory. It was a symbol of resistance, that even in the face of the immeasurable, the will of a people could prevail. But the Greek victory was only the beginning of a series of events that would trigger medical wars, a conflict that would become an epic struggle not only for Greece's survival, but also for the future of Western civilization. After Marathon defeat, Darius I could not leave the affront without a response. The Persian king, now full of anger and determination, swore revenge. The next Persian invasion, which was prepared under its leadership, would be even more imposing. However, Darius's death in 486 BC. He delayed this new attack, and his son Xerxes I assumed the leadership of the Persian Empire. Xerxes, determined to avenge Marathon humiliation, prepared a much more ambitious invasion. The second Persian invasion began in 480 BC, with a much greater force, including an army that, according to ancient historians, exceeded 1 million men, although real numbers may have been minor. The Persian army, which now included not only infantry and cavalry, but also an impressive fleet, headed towards the heart of Greece, determined to crush once and for all the Greek resistance. Meanwhile, the Greek cities, aware of the imminent threat, began to join in a coalition that had never been seen before. Athens, Sparta, and other city-states that were normally at war with each other understood that Persian invasion not only meant a threat to their independence, but for their way of life. The common enemy forced these rival cities to put aside their differences and form an alliance, forged not only in the need, but in the conviction that their survival depended on the unit. The first confrontations were epic, beginning with the famous Battle of the Thermopylas, where a small Spartan army, led by King Leonidas, remained firm before the Persian invasion. Although the Spartans, known for their courage and discipline, were finally defeated, their heroic sacrifice became a legend. the resistance of Leonidas and its 300 Spartans became a symbol of courage, resistance to the impossible, and the determination to fight until the last breath. At the same time, at sea, the Battle of Salamina was fought with an equally crucial outcome. The Greek fleet, under the direction of Themistocles, managed to deceive the huge Persian fleet, defeating it in a naval fight that would change the course of the war. The victory in Salamina was not only a naval victory, but a demonstration that intelligence and strategy could prevail over gross power. The medical wars were more than simple battles between two empires. They were a struggle for freedom, for identity, and for survival. As the Greeks repelled the Persian invasions, the belief in their independence was consolidated, and the Western world began to understand that their future depended on this small corner of the world. The final defeat of the Persians, and the subsequent withdrawal of Xerxes marked the end of Persian invasions in Greece. Although the Persian Empire continued to exist for more generations, those battles and Greek victories resonated in history, transforming into the foundations of what would be Western civilization, with its emphasis on freedom, democracy, and self-determination. The medical wars, more than a series of war clashes, became the melting pot where the ideals that would define the future of an entire culture would be forged. The sun shone intensely on the Marathon Plain, and although the air was loaded with dust and tension, no one could even imagine that, in a few hours, that field would become the stage of one of the most unlikely victories in history. Persian, massive and well-organized forces advanced with confidence towards the small Greek army. In his mind, there was no doubt, Greece's invasion would be just one more formality in the extensive kingdom of Darius I. But that morning, in the distance, something unexpected began to take shape. That Greek army, mainly composed of Athenians, was much smaller than the Persian, and the chances were clearly against him. While the Persians advanced, the Greeks remained firm, and in their hearts a determination was beaten that it was not only a matter of strategy, but of identity. Greece was at stake. Freedom, culture, the Greek way of life, all that defined his world, was on the line. And so, despite the disadvantages, the Greek army, under the command of Miltiades, decided that this would not be an any day. Marathon's battle was a strategy lesson. Instead of waiting for the Persians to approach Athens, the Greeks took the initiative. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the Athenians organized their troops with an innovative formation. At first it seemed crazy, an unreasonable challenge. But Greek courage, combined with cunning leadership, resulted in unstoppable tactic. The Athenians surrounded the Persians, attacking with fury, without allowing them the space to maneuver. That was a decisive defeat for the Persian army, which could not sustain the attack on all fronts. In a few hours, the Persians were forced to retire, leaving behind a field full of dead and wounded. Marathon's defeat was more than a simple military setback. It was a devastating psychological blow to the Persian Empire, an unexpected humiliation that crumbled the image of invincibility they had cultivated throughout their expansion. Darius I, accustomed to seeing his enemies bend to his power, could not bear the fact that his army, the most formidable in the world, would have been defeated by a much smaller and less experienced army. That victory of the Athenians not only meant that Greece remained safe at the moment, it was a statement that Persians were not invincible, and that even the world's largest empire could be defeated. For the Greeks, Marathon was a turning point. Not only was it a military victory, but a symbol of what it meant to be Greek, the ability to face the impossible and get victorious. The Greek culture, built on ideals such as freedom and autarky, was reinforced after this victory. The Athenians not only celebrated their victory on the battlefield, they celebrated their identity, their resistance to a much more powerful enemy. Marathon became an essential part of the Greek narrative, a story that would feed the spirit of resistance not only in the following years, but for centuries. But the consequences of the defeat of the Persians were not limited to Greece. In Persia, humiliation was deep. Darius I, who had planned to invade Greece as a way to reaffirm his domain, could not bear that the Greeks had challenged and defeated. Although the Persian king dedicated himself to consolidating his power in the east and reinforcing the borders of the empire, the blow received in Marathon was recorded in his mind. The need to avenge this defeat would become an obsession, and in a few years, his son Xerxes I would begin to plan a much more ambitious invasion. The defeat of the Persians also had a crucial effect on relations between Greek cities. At first, the fact that the Athenians were the main responsible for victory caused tensions with other polis, such as Sparta, which had not participated directly in the battle. However, over time, the need to face the Persian threat united Greek cities, despite their differences. The medical wars, which would be triggered a few years later, would be a fight in which the lessons learned in Marathon would be vital. Marathon, on the other hand, also marked the beginning of a deep change in the way the Greeks perceived themselves. They were not just a series of small cities divided by local interests, they were a culture with a common identity, capable of facing imperial power and winning. The victory not only encouraged patriotism and Greek unity, but also left an indelible brand in its art, its philosophy, and its policy. The Marathon victory was held in the theatres, in the sculptures and writings of the great philosophers. From that moment on, the Greeks began to forge a legacy that would go beyond survival. They aspired to greatness. Marathon also had a deep impact on the way the Persians saw the Greeks. That defeat dismantled the idea that the Greeks were little more than a series of primitive tribes. The Persians began to understand that, although their empire was the greatest and most powerful of their time, the Greeks possessed something much more valuable: the fire of freedom, the determination of a culture that could not be subjected without struggle. That was the real Marath lesson on. In that field, that day, not only physical battles were fought. Culture, fate, and identity were intertwined in the dust of the plain. Marathon was not only a Greek victory, it was a transcendental turn in the course of history, a victory that would resonate for generations, changing the face of the ancient world. The wind blows strongly on the battlefield in the Thermopylae. The Greeks, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, were ready to face what seemed to be an unstoppable tide. Before them, the Persian army, commanded by Xerxes I, advanced with its incredible army, which some stories describe as 1,000,000 men. Even with that overwhelming numerical disadvantage, the Spartans did not hesitate. They knew that Thermopylae were not only a strategic place on the map, but a symbol of resistance, struggle for freedom and independence. This battle would mark the beginning of a new phase of medical wars and the destiny of an entire civilization. Xerxes I, the son of Darius I, faced a complicated situation. After the humiliating defeat of his father in Marathon, he swore to avenge the affront and finally submit to Greece. For that, he prepared a much larger invasion, gathering a formidable army that crossed not only Persian territories, but also allies of various parts of the empire. Its fleet, also gigantic, extended along the coast of the Aegean, a sample of Persian naval power. Meanwhile, the Greek cities, aware of what came to them, began to join in a coalition. However, not all cities had the same disposition to fight. Some were still trapped in their internal rivalries, but others, such as Athens and Sparta, understood the magnitude of the danger they faced. The initial step towards the catastrophe was the Battle of Thermopylae. The Greeks knew that they could not compete in number with the Persians, but chose this narrow step in which their battle formation could counteract Persian superiority. There, 7,000 men aligned to stop the advance of a force that seemed endless. The Spartans, with their shields shining under the morning sun, remained firm, fighting with a courage that went beyond any expectation. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, who joined the other Greek soldiers, resisted with unparalleled tenacity, but knew that their sacrifice was inevitable. For 3 days, the Persians tried to break the Greek resistance, but the defenders, perfectly organized, did not give in. The difference in training and discipline was palpable, and the Persians, accustomed to sweeping their enemies with numerical superiority, found themselves fighting in a field where they could not take advantage of their advantages. It was a sample of what unity and strategy in war meant. However, in the end, the Greeks were betrayed by a spy, which allowed the Persians to surround the passage. With the unsustainable situation, Leonidas and his men decided to be left behind and fight until the end, to allow the rest of the Greek army to retire and save the city. The heroic sacrifice of the 300 Spartans would be recorded in the collective memory, symbolizing the fight to the last drop of blood for freedom. The defeat in the Thermopylae was not a total defeat for the Greeks. Instead, it was a catalyst for a series of crucial victories. The resistance of the Spartans in that narrow step showed that the Persians would not be invincible and that, even in extreme circumstances, the Greeks could offer resistance. That lesson resonated throughout Greece, joining them in a common cause. Just a few days later, the fight continued at sea, in the Battle of Salamina. The Persian fleet, which had moved towards the Aegean, seemed invincible, but the Athenians, under the leadership of Themistocles, planned a risky but ingenious maneuver. They knew that, if the Persians dominated the sea, there would be no way to stop their progress. Although the Greek fleet was in numerical inferiority, the Athenians attracted the Persians towards a narrow channel between the Salamina Islands. The maneuver resulted in a decisive victory for the Greeks, who managed to destroy much of the Persian fleet. The naval victory in Salamina marked a fundamental turn in the war. Xerxes, who had trusted the superiority of his navy, was forced to retire and rethink his strategy. Meanwhile, the Persians, injured by their defeat at sea, did not give up. Xerxes still maintained the hope of submitting Greece, but his plans were frustrated in the Battle of Plataea, in 479 BC. The Greeks, now united as never before, faced the Persian forces once again, which seemed more disorganized and weak. Plataea was the definitive inflection point. Despite the bravery of the sold Persian terraces, the cohesion of the Greek forces, especially the hoplites, and the experience acquired in the previous battles, allowed the Greeks to inflict an overwhelming defeat to the forces of Xerxes. This victory sealed the fate of the Persian Empire in Greece. Xerxes, after these defeats, was forced to withdraw his troops, and the Persian invasion was finally stagnant. The Persian Empire would never conquer Greece. The Second Medical War, which had begun as an attempt at revenge and imperial expansion, ended up being a humiliation for Persian power. For the Greeks, however, these victories were much more than simple military triumphs. They represented the resurgence of their identity, the rebirth of their spirit. The sacrifice of Leonidas, the cunning of Thebes in Salamina, and the unity of the Greek forces in the Plate were heroic deeds that would forge the narrative of what, over time, the Western civilization would be called. The consequences of the Second Medical War were deep and lasting. Greece left her stronger and more unified under common ideals that would shape her future. Meanwhile, Persia, although it was still a formidable power, suffered the wear of those failed invasions. The medical wars, with their battles, sacrifices and victories, showed that sometimes the value, strategy and unity of a people can change the course of history. The sun began to hide behind the majestic mountains of the northwest of India, staining the sky of a deep orange. In the air the fragrance of spices and distant lands floated, while caravans of merchants and soldiers were traveling through the vast plains that separated the Persian Empire from the rich Indian. At the intersection of these two different worlds, the Persian Empire and India shared a border that was not only marked by mountains and rivers, but by centuries of interactions that, although at some times they were conflicting, also brought with them a cultural exchange, commercial and military without equal. The relationship between Persia and India began at the time of Cyrus el Grande, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, who extended his domains to the current Pakistan region, annexing the Indus Valley. This territory became one of the most important satrapia of the empire, called the Satrapia of India or Gandhara. Cyrus not only conquered these lands, but also established a trade and communication network that united the peoples of the Indian subcontinent with the vast Persian Empire. With the expansion of Darius I, the relationship between Persia and India deepened even more. The great Persian king not only assured his dominion over the most oriental regions, but also opened the doors to endless exchanges. The Persians, with their advanced infrastructure, their paths, and their postal network, facilitated trade between the two worlds. Through the route known as the Royal Route, Indian merchants could carry their spices, precious stones, and fabrics to Persian markets, while the Persian Empire sent India metals, weapons, and, in some cases, artifacts of luxury. But the relationship was not only commercial. The eastern border was also a constant friction zone, where the Persian Empire should fight to maintain control of the acquired territories, facing local kingdoms and tribes that resisted foreign domination. In the 5th century BC, the Persians met a fierce opposition by the local tribes of the northwest region of India. However, the Persians, with their well-trained army and their cunning political strategy, managed to maintain their dominance for a while, establishing control over the cities of Gandhara and other important shopping centers. The Persian Empire not only influenced India from a political and economic point of view, but also cultural. The exchanges between both civilizations brought mutual influences. Persian artisans, for example, began to incorporate elements of Indian art into their own creations, while the Indians adopted certain aspects of Persian architecture. The large stone structures that the Persians built in their cities were admired by the inhabitants of the subcontinent, who were attracted to the magnificence of Persian cities such as Persepolis. At the same time, the arrival of the Persian Empire northwest of India allowed the transmission of philosophical and religious ideas. Although Zoroastrism, the official religion of the Persian Empire, was never completely adopted in India, ideas about dualism between good and evil began to influence some Indian philosophical currents. The contact with the Persians also contributed to the flowering of some schools of thought in the subcontinent, which were nourished by the interactions and these two great civilizations. However, despite exchanges and commercial ties, relations between Persia and India were also marked by the conflict. As the centuries passed, and the Persian Empire continued to face internal and external challenges, control over their eastern territories weakened. Alexander the Great's invasion in 330 BC. He completely changed the dynamics between Persia and India. Alejandro, after defeating Dario III and conquering the Persian Empire, advanced northwest of India, where he fought the famous Battle of the Hydaspes River against King Poros. Although Alejandro was received by a formidable army, his victory in India, although ephemeral, left a deep mark in the region. After the fall of Persia and the rise of Alejandro's successors, the Seleucids, the relationship between the Indian subcontinent and the Western territories remained significant. Commercial exchanges between India and the Greek world continued, although Persian influence on the region began to fade. Despite this, the vestiges of Persian influence could still be seen in the region, from commercial routes to architectural structures. In India, Persian influence was mainly perceived in the regions of the northwest, such as Gandhara, which would later become a Buddhist art center. Gandhara's temples and sculptures, known for its mixture of Greek and Persian elements, are a testimony of the rich cultural interaction between these two worlds. Gandhara's art shows the influence of Hellenistic sculpture and Persian architectural techniques, indicating a melting pot of ideas and styles. In addition, in the political sphere, the local dynasties of India, such as the Mauryas, which emerged in the 4th century BC, maintained diplomatic relations with the successors of the Persians. The most famous of these exchanges was the Greek-sent Megasthenes, who was sent by the Greek king Seleucus I to the court of the Indian emperor Chandragupta Maurya. Although the Persian Empire no longer existed in its original form, its legacy lasts in diplomacy and international relations of the time. Although the following centuries brought with them political changes and the fading of the Persian Empire, the relationship between Persia and India never completely vanished. The exchanges continued, feeding trade and culture. The passage of time, the invasions, and the changes of empires failed to erase the footprint that both worlds left each other. Somehow, the border between Persia and India continued to be a connection point, a place where the East and West were found, sharing wealth, knowledge and dreams. And, through that relationship, both civilizations left a legacy that lasted long after their empires faded in oblivion. The caravans advanced slowly through the vast desert, loaded with bright silk, aromatic spices, precious stones, and other exotic treasures. At each stop, merchants from different cultures exchanged stories and goods, creating a melting pot of civilizations. The Silk Route was not just a trade path, it was a vital artery that united East and West, and through it not only the exchange of goods, but also of ideas, religions, and cultures. In the heart of this network of commercial routes, the Persian Empire played a crucial role. By taking advantage of the strategic position he occupied between the East and the West, Persia not only benefited economically, but also became a melting pot of diplomacy, creating unparalleled prosperity in the ancient world. Since Cyrus el Grande, Persia had understood the power of transcontinental trade. The lands of the Achaemenid Empire extended from the rich and fertile plains of Iran to the distant regions of Central Asia, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, facilitating access to the Silk Route, which China connected with the Mediterranean. The Persians not only controlled land trade routes, but also access to the sea, which allowed them to exchange products with the maritime powers of the ancient world, such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The Silk Route was, in many ways, the soul of Persian trade. It was a network of roads and river routes that extended through Central Asia and reached China, India, and Europe. The Persians, when establishing and protecting these routes, ensured the constant flow of valuable goods that reached their markets. The Persian Empire was not only a receiver of these products, but also an intermediary that facilitated the exchange between the most distant civilizations. Through Persia, silk, paper, and porcelain of China reached the Western world, while spices, gold, and textiles of India and Africa were distributed throughout the empire. This luxury trade not only brought material wealth, but also an exchange of ideas. The caravans of merchants and diplomats traveled long distances, crossing deserts and mountains, carrying with them knowledge and traditions of distant lands. The Persians, being in the center of this network, acted as mediators and facilitators of this cultural exchange. The city of Persepolis, the jewel of the empire, became a melting pot of cultures, where the influences of the Far East, Greece and Egypt mixed with local traditions, creating a vibrant city that was a will of wealth and diversity of the empire. The Persians also benefited from the diplomacy that accompanied these commercial routes. Transcontinental trade was not only a matter of merchants and goods, but also of diplomatic relations. The Persian kings established links with the powers of India, China, Greece and other regions along the Silk Route. The trade between these civilizations was often marked by diplomatic treaties, alliances, and political marriages, which helped maintain peace and encourage exchange. Persian ambassadors traveled to distant territories, carrying not only goods, but also offers of friendship and collaboration. These treaties were vital to ensure the flow of goods and stability in the region. Persian cities, such as Susa and Ctesiphonte, prospered thanks to this commercial network. They were commerce centers where merchants from all parts of the world were negotiating in the markets full of silk, gold, spices, and ivory. The streets of these cities were full of stores and stalls that exhibited products from the most remote corners of Asia and Africa. Trade in these cities not only enriched the empire, but also allowed Persians to develop an advanced infrastructure with networks of roads, bridges, and communication systems that facilitated trade through vast distances. As the Persian Empire expanded, so did its influence on the Silk Route. Under the Achaemenid kings, Persia became an economic superpower thanks to its control over commercial routes. Darius I, in particular, played a fundamental role in the expansion of imperial infrastructure. Its administrative reforms and the construction of a vast road of roads, such as the famous Royal Route, made trade through the empire faster and more efficient than ever. These routes not only connected the different parts of the empire, but also linked Persia with the outside world. In the crossroads of Persia, the caravans of merchants were soldiers and diplomats, creating a fluid communication and trade network. The Silk Route also represented the rise of Persian power in the cultural field. The arts and ideas flourished in Persia thanks to the constant exchange of knowledge. The influence of the Greek culture, which was at the western end of the route, merged with Persian traditions, creating a unique mixture of art, architecture, and philosophy. Persian sculpture, painting, and architecture acquired new nuances thanks to interaction with the cultures of India and Greece. Religion was also an exchange field. Zoroastrism, the religion of Persia, began to influence other regions, while Buddhism and Hinduism made raids into Persian territories, creating a rich and diverse mixture of beliefs. Transcontinental trade, then, was not only an economic engine for the Persian Empire, but also consolidated its power and influence in the ancient world. The Silk Route allowed Persia to play a crucial role in the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures, being one of the most advanced civilizations in terms of connectivity and diplomatic relations. Through its commercial routes, Persia not only joined continents, but also created a prosperity that would mark the history of the ancient world. The golden light of the sun leaped through the palm trees, illuminating the vast fields of wheat and barley that extended along the Iranian plateau. In the fields, the peasants, with their faces tanned by the sun and business hands, worked the earth, sowing and harvesting the fruits that would feed the entire empire. Agriculture, fundamental to the Persian economy, was the throbbing heart of everyday life. From the fertile lands next to the Euphrates River to the slopes of the mountains, the farmers cultivated an impressive variety of cereals, fruits, and vegetables that not only supplied to the Persian cities, but also sent to distant territories, feeding the trade that it flowed through silk routes. As the sun was put on the golden fields, life in Persian cities began to collect a different rhythm. The agitation of the markets, the bustle of artisans in their workshops, the laughter of the children running through the streets of bricks. The city became a vibrant center of activity. The great cities of the empire, such as Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, were true reflexes of the wealth and diversity that characterized ancient Persia. They were centers where cultures, religions, and races were intertwined, where the roads that crossed Asia, Europe, and Africa converged, bringing with them a host of products and customs. Trade was the blood that ran through the veins of these cities. Merchants from all the empire, and even beyond, gathered in the markets that extended as labyrinths of silk-filled positions, spices, precious metals, and jewelry. Persian, cunning and refined merchants not only exchanged products, but also shared stories and knowledge with visitors everywhere. The gold of the mines of Persia was combined with the spices of India, the porcelain of China, the ivory of Africa, and the wine of Greece, creating a mosaic of cultures and products that enriched both merchants and common citizens. But life in the empire not only revolved around trade. The social structure, as complex as the empire itself, determined the place of each individual in the vast Persian machinery. On the cusp of the pyramid were the nobles and the royal family, who lived in luxurious palaces adorned with fine carpets and marble columns, surrounded by the treasures that the empire had accumulated. These palaces were not only centers of power, but also of culture. In the big cuts, poets, musicians, and philosophers were received with honor, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and reflection. The banquets were solemn occasions, where kings and nobles shared exquisite delicacies while arguing state issues or enjoyed stories and songs. Below the nobility, the majority of the population consisted of farmers, artisans, and merchants, who held vital roles in the functioning of the empire. Persian artisans were famous for their skill in the manufacture of luxury objects, textiles, carpets, ceramics, fine metals. Persian cities were known for the exquisite quality of their products, which were often exchanged through commercial routes towards other civilizations. The markets were the soul of the city, where people gathered not only to buy and sell, but to socialize, discuss, and share news. Among the sounds of the market bells, the whispers of the latest news, and the laughs of the children who were running through the squares, the day-to-day was developed in a tangle of frantic activity. Life in cities was not only work, but also of entertainment and culture. The Persians were known for their love for art and beauty. In every corner of the cities, the palaces and temples were adorned with intricate sculptures and frescoes that represented the glorious victories of the kings and the majesty of the gods. Theatrical performances, concerts, and banquets in honor of the gods were events that united the population in a common feeling of worship and joy. Religious festivities and sacrifices were moments of deep devotion, but also community, in which the inhabitants of the cities gathered to pay tribute to their deities and their kings, who were considered as intermediaries between the gods and mortals. In rural areas, far from the bustling life of the big cities, the life of the peasants and the nomadic tribes followed a different rhythm. Agriculture, with its arduous work and its marked stations, dominated everyday life. The relationship with the earth was deep and transcendental, because it depended not only for daily livelihoods, but also the identity of the family and the community. The villages, although simpler than large cities, were also the center of social and religious life. Temples and schools were meeting points where old traditions and wisdom were taught, and religious celebrations gave meaning to people's lives. Water, a vital resource in arid Persia, had incalculable value. The Persians were experts in hydraulic engineering, and their aqueducts and channels provided water both for the irrigation of the fields and for the supply of cities. These technological advances not only facilitated agriculture, but also contributed to the development of an even more efficient trade network. In Persian gardens, famous for its beauty and its symbolism of abundance, water became a sacred element, representing prosperity and life itself. Life in the Persian Empire, as a whole, was a complex tapestry of work, culture, trade, religion, and family. From the fields to the palaces, from the markets to the sacred temples, all were part of a large machine that, for centuries, kept the splendor of one of the most great civilizations in history. But beyond the structures, symbols, and rituals, which really gave life to Persia was the common people, the farmers who cultivated the land, the merchants who crossed continents, the artisans who created beauty, and the families that, with effort and sacrifice, kept the legacy of an empire alive that, even today, is still remembered for its greatness. The soft breezes that caressed the vast plains of Persia not only carried with them the aroma of spices and the unmistakable echoes of the market, but also the silent but firm voices of those women who, despite the difficult times, wove the basis of a civilization that, although dominated by men, could never have reached its greatness without them. Often hidden in the shadows of history, Persian women played an essential role in everyday life, in the family and, sometimes, even in politics, challenging the expectations of the time and leaving an indelible mark. In the ancient world, women were generally relegated to the domestic sphere. In Persia, his place was traditionally at home, where his main function was to take care of the family, keep the house, raise the children and ensure the continuity of the family line. However, despite this limitation in their public role, Persian women were not mere spectators of social and political life. Their influence was far beyond what the eyes could see. The life of a Persian woman was governed by the patriarchal structure of the empire, but this was not a jail without exit. In the Achaemenid society, the right of women was closely linked to their social status. The women of the nobility or royalty enjoyed greater freedom and autonomy, which allowed them to make political decisions and even exercise some authority. The queen or wife of a king was not only seen as a symbol of the stability of the empire, but also as a figure that could influence the destinies of the nation. Persepolis, the majestic capital of the empire, not only housed the powerful kings, but also women who had a fundamental role in court and in the administration of imperial affairs. A remarkable example of female influence in ancient Persia was the figure of Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great and wife of Darius. Atossa was not only an influential queen, but also a woman who, because of her lineage and wisdom, had a great impact on the empire policy. During the war with Greece, Atossa played an essential role, advising her husband Darius in state affairs and being a key figure in the Persian court. His life was not only a reflection of power, but also the importance that the women of the elite could achieve in a society that, although patriarchal, recognized their abilities. However, beyond the figures of royalty and nobility, many Persian women performed significant roles within family and society. Although common women had limited access to education and direct participation in public affairs, their importance at home could not underestimate themselves. Mothers were responsible for educating children, transmitting values, traditions, and skills that ensured the stability and continuity of Persian culture. His task of preserving traditions and teaching future generations was essential for the maintenance of the social structure. Despite the restrictions, Persian women also had certain rights. They had the ability to own properties, administer land, and participate in marriages. In fact, marriage was an important institution within Persian society, and women had a voice in their choice, especially among the upper classes. The right to divorce, although not as accessible as in other cultures, existed, and women could influence family decisions and the administration of their assets. This right, although limited, offered a measure of independence within a society in which the male authority dominated. Persian women also had an important role in religion. Zoroastrism, the dominant religion in Persia, included female participation in rituals and ceremonies. Women could be priestesses and officiate in temples, which gave them a degree of respect and a position of power within religious communities. Although most women in Persia did not occupy religious positions of altar rank, the possibility of being an active part in spiritual life gave them a voice in a society that generally silenced them in earthly affairs. In the domestic sphere, Persian women were also experts in the arts of fabric, ceramics, and clothing preparation. The beautiful Persian carpets, recognized worldwide for their intricate design and their quality, were often created by women. These activities were not only sources of livelihood for families, but also represented a form of cultural expression. Persian women, in their daily lives, created beauty through their hands, producing objects that would later be considered treasures. In addition, Persian women shared their lives with the figures closest to their circle, slaves. Although the slaves in Persia were generally considered as property, some acquired a considerable influence within their homes, serving as confidants, loves, and, sometimes, even as assistants of noble women. The relations between these slaves and their loves, although marked by the differences in status, also were part of the complex social network that characterized the empire. The history of women in the Persian Empire is full of nuances, and although many times their voices were overshadowed by the brightness of the great male figures, their contribution was essential for the construction of society and the empire. Through their wisdom, their work, and their influence, Persian women left an indelible mark that resonates in the passage of time. In their homes, in their gardens, in the palaces, and in the temples, the whisper of their lives and their efforts remains an integral part of the vast legacy of Persia. The dawn about the mountains of Persia seemed to dye the sky of an almost mystical intensity. The light touched the ancient Zoroastric temples, whose structures, robust and ornate, were witnesses of a faith that had been cultivated in the heart of the empire. At the moment, while the first shadows of the night fell on the earth, the flames of the altars burned strongly, an unwavering symbol of the divine presence. Religion in the Persian Empire was not only a practice, but a vital fabric that influenced every aspect of everyday life, from the most transcendental political decisions to the small rituals of daily life. Among all the religious systems of the Persian world, Zoroastrism shone like the lighthouse that guided civilization towards light. Zoroastrismo, the religion founded by the prophet Zoroastro or Zarathustra, was much more than a simple belief. It was a spiritual path that proposed a dualistic world, an eternal conflict between good and evil, represented by Ahura Mazda, the supreme and creator god, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive and malignant force. In this framework of cosmic struggle, each human being had the ability to make decisions that would directly influence the balance between these two worlds. Zoroastrismo taught the importance of truth, honor, justice, and purity, values that, over the centuries, mold not only the spiritual life, but also the political and social life of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was not a monolithic religious entity. Although Zoroastrismo was the official faith, religious plurality also played a crucial role in the life of its inhabitants. The magnitude of the empire, with its vast extension that covered diverse territories and dissimilar cultures, generated a religious syncretism environment. The Persians, instead of imposing their faith, were known for their religious tolerance and their willingness to integrate elements of the religions of the conquered regions. Thus, the Persian religion absorbed and mixed with the beliefs of peoples such as Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and the Indians, creating a rich variety of spiritual practices that coexisted under the vast umbrella of the Achaemenid Empire. Syncretism was not only limited to the incorporation of gods and practices, but also to religious philosophy. Zoroastrismo, with its emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, found parallels with other nearby beliefs, such as those of Egypt, where there was also a notion of cosmic order and chaos. This exchange and the fusion of ideas allowed a much more flexible and dynamic spirituality. The Persians, being integrated with other cultures, were nourished by a religious plurality that not only enriched their thinking, but also allowed them to adapt to a world in constant change. Ritual practices in Persia were impregnated with symbolism and spiritual depth. Each action had a sacred purpose. The sacred fires, which were uninterrupted in the temples, represented the purity and light of Ahura Mazda. The rituals, often made by priests, were aimed at maintaining the cosmic balance and protect the order of the world. One of the most important acts was the veneration of fire, considered the closest element to divinity. During the ceremonies, prayers were recited in Avetico, the sacred language, and sacrifices were offered in honor of the gods. The rituals not only had a religious purpose, but also a strong community component, since the sacrifices and offerings were made by and for the community, creating a deep connection between the divine and the earthly. But Zoroastrismo not only revolved around rituals and sacrifices. His philosophical teachings had a deep impact on the morality of the Persian people. The concept of good mind, or Asha, which represented truth and divine order, became the foundation of personal and social ethics. Zoroastrismo taught that, through correct thought, the correct word and the correct action, a person could contribute to the fight against evil and favor the triumph of good. This principle also influenced Persian leadership, especially in the figures of the great kings such as Cyrus el Grande and Darius I, who presented themselves as defenders of the cosmic order and justice on earth. Despite being a predominant faith, Zoroastrism coexisted with a variety of other beliefs within the empire. In Persian cities, especially in great capitals such as Persepolis and Susa, you could find temples dedicated to other religious gods and practices. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks who resided in these territories not only brought their assets and customs, but also their beliefs. On many occasions, religions mixed, creating a climate of respect and understanding that, although influenced by politics, allowed cultures to maintain their traditions. The influences of Zoroastrism also went beyond Persia. As the Persian Empire expanded, the principles of their faith infiltrated neighboring cultures. In Greece, for example, Greek philosophers, upon contact with the Persians, began to adopt ideas about the morality and destiny that parallels shared with Zoroastrist thought. This influence of ideas contributed to greater reflection on the nature of good and evil, as well as on free will and fate, issues that would later be deeply explored in Western philosophy. The relationship between religion and politics in the Persian Empire was also an essential part of the functioning of the empire. Persian kings were not only political leaders, but also religious figures. As representatives of Ahura Mazda on earth, the kings should ensure that their actions were always in line with the Zoroastrista's principles, seeking justice and prosperity for their people. Thus, politics and religion were intertwined in a single force that guided the empire, and the king's actions were seen not only as political decisions, but also as divine actions. The Persian Empire, with its great belief system and its ability to integrate different religious influences, created a spiritual and philosophical structure that endured for centuries. The rituals, the teachings of Zoroastrism, and the constant search for order and justice marked not only the life of the Persians, but also the history of the ancient world. When the majestic horizon of the ancient Persian capitals is contemplated, such as Persepolis, the weight of the story that rises from the stones is felt, as if each structure told a story of power, pride, and vision. Persian architecture was not only about building great structures, but about creating monuments that reflected the soul of the empire, their magnificence, their religiosity, and, above all, its eternal ambition to dominate the known world. The walls of the palaces, the temples, and the cities built by the Persians were full of symbols and meanings that spoke not only of an empire, but of a people that understood art as an extension of their own divine power. The Persian architectural style was characterized by its monumentality and its grandiosity, reflecting the expansive nature of the Persian Empire. The constructions were massive, but at the same time, carefully detailed, seeking not only functionality, but also aesthetics. Each palace, each temple, each city was designed with the purpose of impressing, to transmit the greatness of the empire and to honor the gods through the majesty of the forms. In Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenids, you can see the culmination of this monumental style. This city, located on an elevated platform in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, was a testament of Persian architectural vision. Its palatial complex, with its huge steps, very high columns, and reliefs meticulously and sculpted, it became a symbol of the authority of the Persian kings. Each corner of Persepolis spoke of power and divinity. The walls were adorned with intricate bases representing delegations of the conquered peoples bringing taxes to the Persian kings, showing not only the diversity of the empire, but also the idea of unity and supremacy Persian. The columns, which rose as stone giants, became one of the most distinctive characteristics of Persian architecture. These columns not only support the roofs of the majestic rooms, but were also a symbol of the strength and stability of the empire. His capitals, sculpted with figures of mythical animals, such as bulls and lions, or with flowers, were designed to express power and beauty in the same unit. The exquisite symmetry of the columns and their imposing presence were a reminder of the perfection that the empire aspired to reach. But Persian architecture not only focused on greatness, but also on the integration of nature in its spaces. Persian gardens, like the famous Garden of Persepolis, were an important characteristic of Persian life. These gardens were not only a refuge for beauty and freshness, but they represented the Ednal Eden, a reflection of cosmic harmony and Persian domain over nature. Water, as a symbol of life and prosperity, flowed in channels and fountains, creating an atmosphere of serenity and balance, all framed by stone walls that maintained the purity of the landscape. The design of Persian gardens, with their precise architecture and their use of natural elements, showed a deep understanding of the relationship between art and nature. Persian ceramics, like its architecture, reflected a sense of delicacy and sophistication. The pieces, often decorated with geometric motifs and mythological figures, showed the artisanal ability of the Persians. Persian ceramists not only created utilitarian utensils, but also works of art that represented scenes of everyday life, animals, religious or mythological scenes. The quality of Persian ceramics was so high that its pieces, exported to different regions of the empire, became luxury and refinement symbols. The vibrant colors and the intricate details revealed the importance of aesthetics in Persian life. In addition to ceramics, textile art played a vital role in Persian art. The Persian Empire was known for its luxurious tapestries and carpets, which were masterpieces of crafts. These tapestries, often made with intricate floral designs or mythological scenes, not only served to decorate the palaces of the monarchs, but also reflected the cultural refinement of the empire. Persian carpets, with their bright colors and complex patterns, became a symbol of opulence and good Persian taste, extending beyond its borders and reaching worldwide recognition. The art of sculpture, especially in reliefs, was also prominent. Persepolis bas-reliefs are a clear example of the ability of Persian artists to capture the majesty of historical stone moments. These representations not only showed the greatness of the Persian kings, but also the diversity of the conquered peoples. Persian artists were experts in transmitting stories through images, and each relief was a visual lesson about authority and order that the Persian Empire wanted to impose on their vast domains. The colors, shapes, and symbols had a deep meaning in Persian culture. The blue color, for example, represented heaven and divinity, while gold symbolized the sun and real power. These colors were not only used in the decoration of palaces and temples, but also in luxury clothes and objects. The Persians understood that art was not only a form of aesthetic expression, but a means to communicate the power, divinity, and permanence of the empire. Persian architecture and art were ultimately a manifestation of the grandiosity of the empire. Each structure, each relief, and each tapestry told a history of domain, power, and faith. Through their monuments and creations, the Persians not only built a physical empire, but created an image of their own greatness, an image that, through the centuries, remains one of the most impressive legacies of the ancient world. The rising sun illuminated the vast plains of the Persian Empire, where the hot breeze carried echoes of a tongue that had gone through generations. In the cities of Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon, the echoes of thousands of voices were intertwined, speaking in various languages, but all converging under the authority of an empire that extended through continents. In those remote days, where written words were as powerful as swords, tongue and writing were the tools that helped with the vast network that united the most diverse peoples in the known world. As the Persian Empire grew, so did the need for a system that could communicate the law, administration, and traditions of a multilingual empire. The Aramaic, a Semitic language that had been adopted by the Babylonians, began to extend as a frank language throughout the empire. Not only was it a vehicle of commerce, but also of diplomacy, justice, and culture. The Aramaic was spoken in the streets of the cities, in the markets, and in the courts, and its influence was such that, even many centuries later, their traces endured in the languages of the surrounding regions. The empire of Cyrus el Grande and its successors not only conquered peoples and lands, but also adopted and adapted various writing systems. However, Babylonian cuneiform writing continued to be of vital importance, especially in the regions of Mesopotamia. This writing system, dating from Sumerian times, was based on wedge-shaped marks that were performed on wet clay tablets. Although the cuneiform alphabet was originated in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, its use was extended in areas under Persian domain, particularly in government administration. But not only the Aramaic and the Babylonian cuneiform occupied a central place in the life of the Persian Empire. In the court of the great Persian kings, such as Darius I, the ancient Persian language took a privileged position. This Indo-European language was used for real and ceremonial inscriptions, especially in monuments. Registration in Behistan's rock, for example, is one of the most emblematic examples of the ancient Persian language. This text, recorded on a huge rock wall in the mountains, not only described Darius I's victory over his enemies, but also served as a message for posterity, written in 3 languages, the Old Persian, the Elamite, and the Babylonian. The use of these languages and writings was not accidental. Each writing form had a specific purpose. The ancient Persian, used in real inscriptions, represented the centralized power of the monarch, its divine authority, and its connection with the god Ahura Mazda. The words recorded on the stones were not simple stories of victories, they were immortal messages, destined to last beyond the empire itself. This use of writing was not only an administrative tool, but also a way to ensure that the greatness of Persian kings was remembered forever. On the other hand, Aramaic was a pragmatic language, useful for communication between the various regions of the empire. It was the language that allowed the merchants of Egypt to negotiate with those of India, and that the subjects of the different satrapia could understand the imperial edicts. Although the ancient Persian was the language of the court and the great monuments, the Aramaic was the daily heartbeat. It was used in diplomatic letters, in commercial records, and in military orders. His simplicity and flexibility made him ideal for such a vast and diverse empire. The adoption of Aramaic also had a significant impact on writing practices. The cuneiform writing, although powerful, was complex, and the scribes required years of training to dominate it. Aramaic, on the other hand, was written with a much simpler alphabet, which allowed more people to learn. This resulted in greater literacy among the population and allowed the messages and documents to be more easily understood by the subjects of the empire. This simplicity also favored the expansion of Persian culture, since ideas and decrees could be written and read by a greater number of people, creating a much more efficient communication system. In the literary field, the languages of the Persian Empire also played an important role. Although much of the ancient Persian literature would be lost over time, the fragments that survived give us an idea of the value that was given to the written words. Stone inscriptions, such as real tombs, were not only administrative texts, but also propaganda vehicles and the construction of imperial identity. The words in these inscriptions not only reported military victories, but also exalted justice, the divinity of the king and the cosmic order that the Persian Empire intended to maintain. The writing system, therefore, was not only an administrative tool, but also a reflection of power, culture, and vision of the Persian world. Persian writings, such as reliefs on the walls of the palaces, they served as an eternal reminder of the divine order that the Persian kings intended to preserve on earth. Each written word, every carved symbol, was a testament of the will of the Persian rulers to leave an indelible mark on the world. The legacy of these Persian languages and writings is not only found in the monuments and inscriptions that have reached us. Its influence can be tracked in the languages that arose after the fall of the empire, in the writings of neighboring cultures that adopted Aramean writing, and in the many religious texts that were preserved throughout the centuries. The cuneiform writing, the Aramaic and the ancient Persian were not only media, but tools that helped to forge the greatest empire that the ancient world had known. And even today, the traces of these first writing systems are still present, as silent witnesses of the magnificence of Persian civilization. In the heart of the vast Persian Empire, where power seemed indestructible, fissures that threatened to break the apparent stability began to emerge. Among these fissures, Egypt, that land of the pharaohs, of ancient traditions and an unwavering pride, rose as an epicenter of resistance. For the Persians, Egypt was not just one more province, it was a strategic territory, a jewel in its imperial crown. But for the Egyptians, being governed by a foreign power was an open wound that never stopped bleeding. The reign of Cambyses II had marked the beginning of the relationship between Persia and Egypt. His conquest was relentless, but the occupation never managed to turn off the spirit of the Egyptians. Although Cambyses was proclaimed pharaoh and adopted certain local customs, his domain was marked by contempt for Egyptian religious traditions, something that was never forgotten. That latent resentment remained as a sleeping volcano, waiting for the right time to explode. Years later, during the government of Dario I, attempts were made to pacify and organize Egypt. Dario, known for his administrative capacity, respected to some extent the customs and Egyptian religion, even ordering the restoration of some temples. But this truce was fragile, a stability mask that hid the resentment accumulated by generations. For the Egyptians, Persia was not an ally or a protector, he was an invader, a constant reminder of his loss of independence. Internal tensions were not limited to Egypt. The Persian Empire was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions, a giant sustained by a complex satrapia network. However, that diversity was also its Achilles heel. In the furthest provinces, the rebellions began to sprout as uncontrolled fires. The Persian administration, although efficient, could not erase the desire for freedom of the submitted peoples. In Egypt, the rebel spirit was fanned by the historical pride of its civilization. The arrival of Xerxes I to the throne was the trigger. This new great king, less inclined to the cultural understanding than his father Dario, tried to impose his authority with an iron hand. The result was disastrous. The Egyptians, fed up with oppression, began a series of revolts that shook the foundations of Persian domain. These rebellions were not simple acts of disobedience, they were desperate screams of a nation that refused to be forgotten. Egyptian leaders found ways to unite their people, appealing to their common heritage and their deep link with the gods. The temples became resistance shelters, and the priests played a crucial role, reminding the people that their struggle was not only for the earth, but also by the preservation of their soul. The Egyptian gods, who had protected their people for centuries, now seemed to demand sacrifices and courage. The internal tensions of the empire intensified even more with conflicts in other regions. In Babylon, another key province, the rebellions also began to gain strength. Persia, an empire built on the conquest, now faced the weight of keeping a giant together with a giant whose end seemed more and more distant. The logistics and resources necessary to quell these rebellions were immense, and each revolt weakened the image of an invincible power. The peripheral provinces were not the only sources of conflict. Within the Persian court, intrigues and struggles for power further complicated the situation. The generals and governors, responsible for maintaining order in the most rebellious regions, often saw crises as opportunities to increase their influence. The internal policy of the empire became a maze in which each decision had the potential to trigger new fractures. Despite his impressive military machinery, Persia faced an enemy much more dangerous than the armies of the rebel provinces: the generalized dissatisfaction. The necessary taxes to finance military campaigns increased the burden on peasants and merchants. In the streets of imperial cities, the murmur of discontent grew, and the fear of collapse began to be around the most loyal. The rebellions in Egypt not only shook the foundations of the empire, but also demonstrated the fragility of Persian domain. Each act of resistance was a call of attention, a warning that an empire cannot be sustained only with force. The stones of the Egyptian temples, witnesses of millennia of history, seemed to whisper the same truth: no foreign power can turn off the flame of a people that refuses to be subjected. In the silent nights, under the stars that illuminated the desert sands, the echoes of the revolts resonated as a song of hope. Egypt, despite its apparent defeat, was still an indomitable nation, a reminder that even the greatest empires can stagger against the unwavering will of those who refuse to forget who they are. The shadow of conflicts and rebellion still hung on the vast Persian Empire when Artaxerxes ascended to the throne. It was an uncertain moment, marked by the inheritance of challenges that seemed insurmountable: internal rebellions, rivalries in the court, and an empire too extensive to be easily controlled. However, Artaxerxes I, known as the Long Hand for his supposed arm longer than the other, was not a common man. His government not only faced crisis, but also tried to reconfigure the structure of Persian power, leaving a legacy that would define the Achaemenid dynasty in its most complicated years. From the beginning, his reign was marked by the need to turn off fires, both literal and figurative. Egypt, the eternal source of problems for the Persians, continued to resist imperial control. The rebellion of Inaros, supported by the Athenians, was one of the most significant challenges facing Artaxerxes. Although the Persians managed to quell the revolt, the cost was huge. It was not only men and resources; each lost or won battle was a reminder that Persian control over its provinces was far from absolute. The conflict with Athens was not limited to Egypt. In the Aegean Sea and Asia Minor, the tensions between Persia and the Greek city-states were still an open wound. Lapaz Deucalias, an agreement that sought to end the hostilities between Athens and Persia, marked a moment of temporal relief. But this treaty also evidenced something that the great Persian kings did not usually admit: their power was no longer unquestionable. Persia, once feared as an unstoppable force, now he had to negotiate with his enemies. Within the empire, the administration of Artaxerxes focused on reinforcing internal structures to prevent fractures from growing. Through a more guarded satrapia system, he tried to maintain control over the most problematic regions. However, the problem of satrapia was both their solution and their threat. The satrapas, mostly Persian nobles or local elites, accumulated a power that sometimes rivaled that of the king himself. The internal rivalries and the betrayals in the court further complicated the management of an already fragile empire. The time of Artaxerxes I was not exempt from lights. In the midst of the storm, his government also witnessed significant achievements in terms of infrastructure and diplomacy. The royal roads continued to be a vital artery for commerce and administration, joining the distant regions of the empire. The inscriptions of his reign show a king aware of his role as protector of his people and defender of the divine order. But under this facade of greatness, reality was much more complex. Persia was no longer the unified empire that had been under Cyrus or Darius. After the death of Artaxerxes I, the throne passed to his son Xerxes II, although his reign was ephemeral, hardly lasting a few months. The struggle for power soon unleashed, and after a period of confusion, Artaxerxes II, brother of Xerxes, ascended to the throne. His arrival marked a new chapter in Persian history, one that would be defined by a balance between crisis and recovery efforts. Artaxerxes II inherited a fragmented empire, but also a tradition of resilience. One of the most significant challenges of his government was the revolt led by his younger brother, Cyrus the Young Man. This internal conflict, known as the Battle of Cunaxa, was a turning point in his reign. Although Artaxerxes II managed on the external front, Artaxerxes II also had to face the consequences of Sparta's expansion and its growing influence in Asia Minor. Persia, who in the past had dominated the Greeks, was now in the position of having to diplomatically maneuver to maintain his position. Despite these challenges, Artaxerxes II managed to stabilize relations with the Greeks through a strategy that mixed concessions and alliances, demonstrating a political ability that would be crucial for the survival of the empire. Within the empire, the reign of Artaxerxes II was also marked by a religious rebirth. During his government, the links with Zoroastrism were reinforced, which remained a fundamental part of Persian identity. The king appeared as a defender of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, and promoted the restoration of temples and sanctuaries throughout the empire. This approach not only sought to consolidate his power, but also unify his subjects under a common vision. But not everything in the reign of Artaxerxes II was stability. The tensions in the provinces continued, and the empire was still a giant with mud feet. In Egypt, once again, resistant spotlights were revived. Egyptian rebellions, fed by accumulated resentment and intervention of foreign powers, became a constant reminder that Persian domain was far from absolute. At nightfall on the vast lands of the empire, the cities shone with the light of fires, but also with the shadows of unresolved conflicts. Artaxerxes I and II had managed to maintain control, although with great effort, about a kingdom that seemed to be on the verge of fragmenting. His reigns were not times of indisputable glory, but of resistance to adversity, political and military maneuvers that defined the ability to adapt to a changing world. In the temples, the Zoroastrian priests prayed for the protection of the empire, while the warriors sharpened their swords for the next battle. The future was uncertain, but the spirit of Persia was still alive, willing to face the storms that were coming. In the court, the great kings knew that the fate of their empire was not alone in their hands, but in those of thousands of subjects that each day faced their own struggles in the name of a kingdom that never stopped changing. In the vast Persian Empire, where the kings were treated as gods and the throne was transmitted as a divine right, a shadow of ambition and betrayal cindered over the Achaemenid dynasty. Artaxerxes II, the great king, had risen to the throne after the death of his father, but not all accepted his authority without questions. Among the discontent was his younger brother, Cyrus the Young Man, a man who believed that the throne belonged to him by right and that he would not hesitate to unleash a storm to claim him. Cyrus, governor of the satrapia of Asia Minor, was a charismatic and ambitious leader. He had proven to be a brilliant strategist and a skilled political manipulator, winning the loyalty of Persian and Greek soldiers equally. But more than his ability, what fed his cause was a burning anger against his older brother, whom he considered a weak and unworthy king. Determined to take power, he began gathering a formidable army, joining under his banner to Greek mercenaries, men hardened by wars in their polis and willing to fight for gold, regardless of the cause. The succession conflict broke out when Cyrus mobilized his forces under the pretext of defending the borders of the empire. The reality was very different. His true objective was to march towards the heart of Persian power and snatch the throne from Artaxerxes II. This movement was not only bold, but also an act of betrayal that shook the foundations of the empire. The news that a Persian prince had recruited Greeks, considered historical enemies, to fight his own brother generated confusion and fear among the elites of the empire. Cyro's march to Babylon, known as Anabasis, was a monumental campaign. Its troops, composed of tens of thousands of Persian soldiers and approximately 10,000 Greek mercenaries, advanced through vast lands, facing bracing deserts and imposing mountains. Each step brought them closer to the final confrontation, and every day the tension grew in the hearts of the men who followed Cyro. The Greeks, led by strategists such as Clearco, saw the campaign as an opportunity, but also began to understand the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The definitive clash took place in Cunaxa, a dusty plain on the banks of the Euphrates River. There, the armies of Cyrus and Artaxerxes found face to face. The battle was fierce, a collision of swords, spears, and war screams that rest. They were under the burning sun. At one point in the contest, Cyrus, in his eager to reach his brother, loaded directly against the royal guard. His courage was unquestionable, but also his recklessness. In a tragic turn, Cyro was killed on the battlefield, leaving his army without a leader and his cause without hope. Cyro's death marked the end of his rebellion, but for Greek mercenaries, the true Odyssey was just beginning. Without a pattern that supported them and surrounded by a hostile empire, the Greeks were trapped in enemy territory, with thousands of kilometers separating them from their home. What followed was one of the most notable epic in ancient history, its march to the north, known as the Anabasis, a term that means march in the interior. Led by Xenophon, a historian and Athenian soldier, the Greeks began a trip full of hardships, facing Persian enemies, hostile tribes, and the inclemency of nature. Every day of the march it was a struggle for survival. The Greeks crossed snow-covered mountains, where the cold cut like blades, and scorching deserts, where thirst became an implacable enemy. Its ranks were reduced with each battle and every exhausting day, but their determination remained intact. In the heart of these men a desire burned: return to their lands, where they could tell the story of their extraordinary feat. Xenophon, whose leadership was key to the survival of the Greeks, said this epic in his work Anabasis, a testimony that has endured through the centuries as one of the most fascinating chronicles of antiquity. In their words, readers can feel the tension, sacrifice, and courage of those men who, despite being far from home and facing impossible probabilities, refused to surrender. Cyrus's rebellion, the young man, and the subsequent Greek Anabasis left an indelible brand in Persian history. For Artaxerxes too, the victory in Cunaxa was a reaffirmation of its power, but also a reminder of the fragility of its position. The scars of this conflict not only affected the royal family, but also the empire as a whole, weakening it against future challenges. The betrayal of a brother and the odyssey of a foreign army became symbols of an empire that, although vast and powerful, was not immune to internal divisions or excessive ambitions. The mountains and deserts that witnessed this epic still keep the echoes of those days. The crib dust, mixed with the blood of princes and mercenaries, remains a reminder that even in the most vast lands, human conflicts are universal, a mixture of ambition, sacrifice, and the unwavering will to survive. In the vast halls of Persepolis, among columns that rose like giants towards the sky, resonated a concern that no one dared to express aloud. On the horizon, a shadow began to grow, a force that few understood, but that everyone felt coming: Macedonia. It was not a foreign kingdom, nor its leader a simple conqueror. Alejandro, young and ambitious, had inherited not only the throne of Philip II, but also a dream that burned with intensity: the total domination of Asia. The Macedonia threat did not arise from nothing. While the Persian Empire had faced decades of internal conflicts, provincial rebellions, and power struggles, Macedonia had been managed as an unstoppable force. Philip II, Alejandro's father, had transformed a fractured kingdom into a revolutionary military machinery. His army was not only disciplined, but also innovative. The Phalange Macedonia, with its long sarissas, represented a new way of making war, a change that the Persians were not prepared to face. When Alejandro assumed the command, he did it with a determination that transcended his age. He was just 20 years old, but his ambitions were as vast as the maps that described the known world. When looking east, he saw the Persian Empire not as an invincible enemy, but as a goal to conquer. He knew that the Persians, although immense in territory and resources, were divided inside, weakened by years of internal conflicts and leadership that no longer inspired fear or respect. Alejandro's first blow was a bold statement. In the year 334 BC, the Hellespont crossed with an army of approximately 35,000 men. It was not an overwhelming force, but what was missing in number compensated with discipline and leadership. The confrontation in the Granic River marked the beginning of its campaign, a blunt victory that shook the Persian provinces in Asia Minor. At that time, it was clear that Alejandro was not an ordinary leader. His strategy, boldness, and ability to inspire his men almost invincible. The real challenge came in Issos, where the Persian army, under the command of Darius III, tried to stop the Macedonian advance. The battle was brutal, a collision of cultures, strategies, and ambitions. Darius, trusting the numerical superiority of his troops, hoped to crush Alejandro. But the young Macedonian had a clearer vision of the battlefield. With a bright maneuver, he broke the Persian lines and forced Darius to flee, leaving his car and his family behind. For the Persians, this defeat was not only humiliating, it was a blow to the very heart of the empire. With every step he took, Alejandro not only conquered land, but also undermined Persian morals. The cities fell before him, and the local governors, seeing the inevitability of their progress, chose to surrender before facing it. Macedonia propaganda also played a crucial role. Alejandro not only presented himself as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a man who would bring order and justice where there were chaos before. The march towards Persepolis was more than a military campaign, it was a symbol of the end of an era. When Alejandro finally reached the Persian capital, the city had already been abandoned by many of its defenders. The greatness of Persepolis, with its reliefs that narrated centuries of Persian glory, became the stage of a tragedy. In an act that many consider revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece, Alejandro allowed the city to be looted and subsequently burned. The flames consumed not only buildings, but also the very essence of Achaemenid power. Darius III, meanwhile, kept fleeing, trying to gather strength for a counterattack. But his destiny was already sealed. Betrayed by his own men, he was killed while Alejandro pursued him through the vast lands of the empire. The young Macedonian, when he found Darius's body, showed a strange respect for the man who had been his rival, giving him a burial worthy of a king. This gesture, although symbolic, reflected Alejandro's strategy to consolidate his domain, not only destroyed his enemies, but also sought to integrate his cultures and traditions. The Persian Empire, which for centuries had been the first superpower of the ancient world, fell not due to lack of greatness, but because of the arrival of an exceptional adversary. Alejandro not only destroyed the empire, he transformed it. By adopting many of the Persian practices and trying to merge Greek and Persian cultures, he tried to create a new era, one in which East and West could coexist under a single government. However, for Persians, defeat was more than the loss of territories or kings. It was a blow to the spirit of a people who had built one of the greatest empires in history. The voices of the elderly spoke of a time when the Persians ruled with force and justice, while the new generations faced the reality of living under foreign domain. And although Alejandro sought to present himself as the legitimate successor of the Persian kings, in the hearts of many, his conquest would always be seen as a reminder of the fragility of power and the inevitability of change. The sun that once shone on the vast Persian Empire began to wear, but the shadows they left were not only defeat. They were also of resistance, of a town that, even in adversity, kept the memory of their greatness alive, waiting for the moment when history could give them another opportunity. The flames that consumed Persepolis not only destroyed a city, they marked the decline of an empire that had ruled with splendor for centuries. The night when the fire rose towards the sky, illuminating the majestic columns and the intricate reliefs that narrated the glory of the Persian kings, it was a night full of symbolism. At that time, the Achaemenid Empire ceased to be the power and sophistication lighthouse that had dominated the known world. Alexander the Great, when he entered Persepolis, did not see only a capital, he saw the heart of Persian power, the place where the Achaemenids had ruled with majesty and authority. For the Macedonians, the city represented the culmination of its victory on which it was once the most feared enemy of Greece. But for the Persians, Persepolis was more than a capital, it was a symbol of his identity, a testimony of his ingenuity, his culture, and his ability to build something eternal. Looting began as an act of revenge. Alejandro, influenced by his generals and perhaps also by his own resentment towards the ancient Persian invasions of Greece, allowed his troops to sweep the city. Macedonian soldiers, exultants after years of struggle and deprivations, broke into the palaces and temples, taking everything that had value. Gold, silver, jewels and treasures accumulated during generations were taken from the imperial chambers. If they could not carry with them, they destroyed it, as if they wanted to erase any vestige of Persian greatness. The decision to burn Persepolis is an issue that has generated debates for centuries. According to the chronicles, the act was instigated by a Greek woman, Tade, during a banquet in which Alejandro and his generals celebrated the victory. It is said that, intoxicated by wine and joy, Alejandro convinced to set the city set up as an act of compensation for the destruction of Athens during medical wars. Alejandro, under the influence of the drink and the emotion of the moment, agreed. With a torch in hand, he led the act that would seal the fate of Persepolis. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by the rich materials decorated by the palaces. Silk curtains, carved woods, and gold-covered roofs fueled the flames that devoured everything in their path. The sculptures and reliefs that narrated the history of the Persian kings began to crumble, leaving behind only ashes and rubble. The smell of smoke was mixed with the cry of animals, the crying of the inhabitants, and the triumphal songs of the Macedonian soldiers. For the Persians who survived, the fire was more than an act of physical destruction, it was a deep humiliation. Persepolis, built by Darius as the jewel of his empire, was more than a city, it was a symbol of divine order and earthly greatness. His fall represented not only the defeat of a people, but also the loss of his spirit. Seeing it reduced to ashes was like witnessing the death of a loved one, a wound that would not easily heal. Although Alejandro tried in later years to justify his act as an impulsive error, the damage was already done. Persepolis's fire became an emblem of the end of the Achaemenid domain and the beginning of a new era. The inhabitants of the empire, who had once seen their kings as lords of the world, now faced a reality in which a foreigner ruled their lands and sat on their throne. But even in destruction, Persepolis left a legacy that could not be erased by fire. The ruins that remained from the city remained a testimony of the ability and vision of the Persians. Historians, both ancient and modern, have described the magnificence of the city, their imposing columns, and their intricate recorded, as proof of a civilization advanced to their time. Despite the devastation, the stones themselves seem to whisper the stories of a glorious past. The fall of Persepolis was not only the end of a city, but also the end of an era. The Achaemenid Empire, which had once extended its influence from Egypt to India, was reduced to fragments, its dispersed greatness between the ashes. Alejandro, although victorious, could not completely eliminate the Persian footprint. Culture, traditions, and memory of their greatness survived, even influencing their conquerors. The flames that illuminated the sky on Persepolis that night were extinguished over time, but their echo persisted in the hearts of those who remembered what was once. In the remains of their columns, in the shadows of its destroyed reliefs, the essence of an empire that, although defeated, was never forgotten. And in each burned stone lies the story of a town that, even in defeat, left an indelible brand in the world. When Alexander the Great took control of the vast Achaemenid Empire, he did not simply destroy what he had been, he also opened the doors to a new era in which East and West intertwined in complex ways and, often contradictory. With his victory over Darius III and his triumphal entry in Persepolis, the young Macedonian was not only crowned as the conqueror of the greatest empire in the ancient world, but also became the heir of a rich, deep, and proud civilization. From the beginning, Alejandro understood that governing Persia could not be achieved solely with the strength of weapons. If I wanted to maintain stability in such an extensive and diverse territory, it should gain respect for the Persians and find ways to integrate their traditions into the new order. Thus, a process began that combined Hellenization with the preservation of essential aspects of Persian culture. This balance, although ambitious, was not exempt from tensions. One of Alejandro's most significant gestures was to adopt Persian practices in his court. It began to wear real spoiled clothing, including the tiara and embroidered tunic, symbols of power that evoked the great kings such as Cyrus el Grande and Darius I. This act, although pragmatic, caused discomfort among their own generals and Macedonian soldiers, who they saw as a betrayal of their Hellenic identity. But Alejandro did not stop there. Introduced the protocol of proskynesis, a ritual reverence before the king that was a deeply entrenched Persian tradition. For Macedonians, this gesture seemed servile and contrary to their equal values, but for the Persians, it was a clear sign that Alejandro respected his inheritance. Cultural fusion was not limited to ceremonial gestures. Alejandro promoted mixed marriages among his noble officers and Persian women. In Susa, he organized a massive wedding in which he married Statua, daughter of Darius III, while other Persian women were given in marriage to their Macedonian companions. Although the intention was to consolidate the union between the Greek and Persian elites, these alliances were often seen with suspicion by both parties. The Persians, proud of their lineage, did not always easily accept the new foreign rulers, while the Macedonians resisted the idea of sharing power with whom they considered their ancient enemies. Under Alejandro's domain, Hellenization began to transform the landscape of the empire. Cities founded by the Macedonians and the Greeks, such as Alexandria in Egypt and other Alexandrias distributed by the empire, became centers of commerce, learning, and Hellenic culture. These cities imported the Greek language, art, and philosophy, establishing a bridge between two worlds. However, this process did not mean the disappearance of Persian culture. In many places, local traditions remained strong, and Persians continued to practice their religion, speaking their languages and managing their territories according to their own customs. Alejandro's death in 323 BC. He left a void of power that resulted in the collapse of his unified empire. His generals, known as the Diadocos, divided the territory, giving rise to dynasties such as the Seleucids, who ruled over a large part of the ancient Achaemenid Empire. Although the Sealing were Greeks in origin, they inherited and preserved many of the Persian administrative structures. The satrapia system, introduced by Darius I, remained the backbone of the administration, demonstrating the efficacy and resilience of Persian institutions. Hellenization continued under Seleucids, but the Persian spirit was never completely eclipsed. In the most oriental regions, such as Parthia and Bactria, local elites began to claim greater autonomy, mixing Hellenic elements with their own traditions. From these lands the Birth Empire would later emerge, a rebirth of Persian power that would challenge the Hellenistic and Roman forces for centuries. Zoroastrismo, the predominant religion of the Achaemenid Empire, also survived the Greek influence. Although the Seleucids promoted their own religious deities and practices, Zoroastrian communities continued to honor Ahura Mazda and maintaining their sacred rituals. The temples of the fire continued to burn, and the Persian priests preserved their scriptures and traditions, making sure that the spiritual essence of the Persian people did not extinguish. The mixture of cultures under Alejandro and its successors was not perfect or equal. There were friction, resistances, and moments of tension between Hellenic ideals and Persian traditions. However, something unique arose from this interaction, a shared cultural legacy that deeply influenced both civilizations. The architecture, art, and philosophy of this period reflect a synthesis that would not have been possible without the contact between Greece and Persia. Although the days of glory of the Achaemenid Empire were left behind, the essence of Persia never disappeared. Even under the government of foreigners, the Persians kept their pride and identity alive. The passage of time would demonstrate that, although empires fall, the cultures that support them have the ability to adapt, resist and, eventually, reborn with new force. And in the shadows of the destroyed palaces, in the cuneiform writings and in the traditions transmitted from generation to generation, Persia kept talking, reminding the world what had been and what it could still be. In the heart of Persia, where the vast plateaus meet imposing mountains and serpentine rivers, myths and legends were born that wove the spirit of a proud people. Persian kings, although mortal, were wrapped in an aura of divinity and heroism. In their stories, reality was intertwined with the fantastic, transforming them into immortal figures whose exploits and virtues were told around the bonfires and in the palace's halls. One of the most venerated stories is that of Cyrus el Grande, known not only as the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, but as a chosen one of the gods. According to legends, before his birth, a disturbing dream visited Astyages, King Meadow. In this dream, he saw a torrent of water that sprouted his daughter's belly, flooding all of Asia. The wizards of the court interpreted this as an omen. Mandane's son would be a conqueror who would eclipse his grandfather. Astyages, fearful, ordered that the newborn to be delivered to Harpago, a loyal server, with instructions to end his life. But Harpago, unable to commit such an act, entrusted the child to a shepherd named Mithridates, who raised him as his own. Cyrus grew like a common child, grazing sheep in the mountains, without knowing that real blood ran through its veins. However, his innate nobility and his leadership soon began to demonstrate. One day, during a game with other children, he was chosen as fictional king. When the games became serious and Cyrus punished a noble child, his true identity was revealed. This event marked the beginning of his destiny as the king who would release the Persians of the Yoke Meadow and found an empire that would cover the known world. The figure of Darius is also wrapped in myths. The story tells that his rise to the throne was not by simple chance, but was predestined by the gods. After the death of Cambyses II, Persia fell into chaos. An impostor, Gormata, was proclaimed king, usurping the throne under the name of Ismerdis, the missing brother of Cambyses. The Persian nobles, suspecting the deception, formed a conspiracy led by Darius. According to tradition, the conspirators decided that whoever was king would be chosen by a divine sign. At dawn, their horses would be taken to the agreed place, and the horse that would first relate to the new sovereign. Darius, cunning and connoisseur of superstition, warned a plan with his stable. He took his favorite horse to the site last night and let him graze in a specific place where he had perceived a mare. At dawn, Darius's horse first whipped when he remembered the smell of the mare, and thus he was proclaimed king. This story, a mixture of human cunning and divine will, cemented Darius's legitimacy and presented it as a leader backed by the gods. Another myth deeply rooted in the Persian tradition is that of Jamshid, a mythical figure that, although it does not belong to the historical lineage of the Achaemenids, symbolizes the greatness and fall of power. According to mythology, Jamshid was a visionary king who brought Persia to an era of gold. During his reign, humanity learned to domesticate animals, spin fabrics, and build homes. It is said that Jamshid had a magical throne that, when rising in heaven, allowed to contemplate all his vast kingdom. However, his pride and arrogance led him to declare himself a god, thus challenging the will of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. The gods, enraged, withdrew their protection, and Jamshid was destroyed by Zahak, a tyrant whose legend is equally chilling. Zahak was a cursed king, holder of 2 snakes that grew from his shoulders and demanded human brains as food. His reign symbolized oppression and decline until Cave, a brave blacksmith, led a rebellion to restore justice. This struggle, although mythological, deeply resonated in Persian consciousness, evoking the eternal conflict between good and evil. Myths not only glorify the kings, they also reveal their humanity and their failures. Xerxes I, known for his ambition to conquer Greece, was subject to stories that reflect the Persian perception of human power. One of the legends tells that, while building a bridge over the Hellespont to invade Greece, a storm destroyed it. Furious, Xerxes ordered that the sea be whipped with chains and beaten with whips, a scene that, although symbolic, reveals the useless struggle of men against nature and divine designs. These stories, although often fantastic, contain deep truths about the values and beliefs of the Persians. The kings were not simply rulers, they were symbols of justice, strength, and sometimes, warnings of the consequences of arrogance. Through them, the Persian people not only remembered their history, but also understood their place in the world, between the divine and the earthly. The words of these legends, transmitted from generation to generation, still resonate, reminding us that behind each throne there is a myth that holds it. In the vastness of ancient Persia, where the flames of temples burned as an eternal symbol of purity, one of the most influential religions of humanity was born, Zoroastrism. Much more than a simple faith, this tradition became the moral and spiritual axis of the Achaemenid Empire, shaping not only the life of the Persians, but also leaving an indelible mark on the great monotheistic religions that would follow: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Zoroastrism, attributed to the Zarathustra prophet, or Zoroaster, as the Greeks called it, introduced ideas that would resonate throughout the Sigil. In the heart of his doctrine was the struggle between good, represented by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth and light, and evil, embodied by Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction. This dualistic vision of the world, where each human action contributes to either side, would be a pillar that would deeply influence other religious traditions. The most notable influence of Zoroastrism began with the contact between the Persians and the Jewish people during the reign of Cyrus el Grande. When Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he released the Jews from Babylonian captivity and allowed his return to Jerusalem. This act not only sealed its place as an anointed in the Jewish tradition, but also marked the beginning of a cultural and spiritual exchange. The idea of a unique God, the cosmic battle between good and evil, and belief in a final judgment seem to have found an echo renewed in Judaism after this period. The concept of Satan in Judaism, as an adversary of good, acquired a more defined way after interaction with Zoroastrian ideas about Angra Mainyu. Likewise, the notion of a Messiah that will bring justice to the world may have been influenced by the figure of the Seoshint, El Salvador prophesied in the Zoroastrismo that will lead the final battle against the forces of evil and will renew the creation. When Christianity emerged centuries later, its Jewish roots were already deeply impregnated with these ideas. The struggle between light and darkness, final judgment, heaven and hell, and even the symbolism of fire as a purifier, have obvious parallels with the teachings of Zarathustra. In the Christian narrative, the sacrifice of Christ as the savior of humanity finds a distant echo in the Zoroastrian traditions about the redemption and renewal of the world. Islam, which would arise in the Peninsular Arabiga centuries later, also showed clear influences of Zoroastrism, especially in its Persian context. During the Islamic expansion, Persia was one of the first great civilizations to be incorporated into the Caliphate. In its adaptation, Islam absorbed Persian cultural and religious elements. The idea of a final judgment, a paradise and hell, and the moral struggle of the individual against evil resonate with the ancient Zoroastrian beliefs. In addition, the Persians, when converted to Islam, brought their deep tradition of reverence for justice, truth, and purity, values that had been the core of their ancestral faith. The symbolism of fire, omnipresent in the Zoroastrian temples, also left its mark. Although Islam rejected the worship of physical symbols, light, as a metaphor of the divine guide, became a central theme. The word Nur, light, appears in the Quran as a representation of the presence of God, an echo of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, whose essence was eternal light. However, the influence of Zoroastrismo was not limited to theological concepts. He also molded ethics and practical philosophy of these religions. The Zoroastrian triad of good thought, good word and good action is reflected in the moral principles of Abrahamic traditions. The idea that each human being has an active role in the struggle between good and evil emphasizes individual responsibility, an echo theme in the teachings of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Despite its impact, Zoroastrismo was largely marginalized after the expansion of Islam in Persia. But its essence never disappeared completely. His stories, his principles, and his spirit survived, not only in the Zoroastrian communities that persisted, as the Parsis in India, but also in the very structures of the religions that happened. Today, when looking back, it is fascinating to see how a faith born in the arid lands of ancient Iran planted seeds that would flourish in cultures and beliefs worldwide. In each sentence that mentions the fight against evil, in each hope of redemption, and in each vision of an eternal paradise, Zarathustra's legacy resonates, a reminder that ideas transcend borders, empires, and eras. In its perpetual flame, Zoroastrismo continues to illuminate, in subtle but deep ways, the paths of humanity. In the theater of words, where history and fiction are intertwined, the Greeks forged a memory of Persia that oscillated between admiration and rejection. From the feathers of epic poets to the voices of historians and playwrights, Persia became a mirror in which the Greeks reflected their fears, their values, and their own identity. For the Greeks, Persia was not just a foreign nation, it was an idea. In the Hellenic imagination, the Persians embodied both splendor and threat. They were the architects of a vast and sophisticated empire, but also the adversaries who had taken Greci to the edge of annihilation. This dualism deeply marked the way they were portrayed in the literature. Herodotus, known as the father of history, played a central role in this representation. His work, Stories, is not only a story of medical wars, but also an exploration of Persian cultures and customs. Herodotus wrote with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. On the one hand, he admired the organization of the Persian Empire, his road network, his postal system, and the diversity of his people. On the other hand, he portrayed the Persians as slaves of a despotic political system, contrasting their alleged submission with the democratic freedom that the Greeks valued as their greatest virtue. The figure of Xerxes I, the king who led the Second Persian invasion of Greece, became a literary symbol of excess and arrogance. In the Greek stories, Xerxes crossed the Hellespont with a bridge built on ships, an act that was interpreted not only as a technical achievement but as an insolent offense to the gods. When a storm destroyed the bridge, Xerxes ordered that the waters be whipped and chained, a scene that reflected not only its anger but its impotence against the forces of nature and destination. The Greeks used this image to underline the hybris, or arrogance, which considered the fatal defect of the Persians. Aeschylus, the great Greek playwright, perpetuated this image in its tragedy The Persians. Written from the perspective of the defeated, the work focuses on the Persian court after the defeat in Salamina. Here, Aeschylus presents the Persians as a noble but tragically fallible people, victims of the excessive ambition of their king. The mother of Xerxes, Atossa, laments by the fall of her people, and through her pain, the playwright humanizes the Persians, while celebrating Greek victory as a triumph of moderation and reason over excess and excess oppression. However, not all Greek literature demonized Persia. Some philosophers and writers recognized positive aspects in their culture. Xenophon, a disciple of Socrates, wrote Cyropaedia, a work that idealized Cyrus the Great as an exemplary ruler. In it, Cyrus appears as a fair, wise, and magnanimous leader, a virtue model even for Greek standards. Although Cyropaedia was partly a pedagogical work rather than historical, its portrait of Cyrus reflects a fascination with Persian administration and ethics that contrasts with the most critical visions. The concept of Orientalism, although not defined in those terms in antiquity, was already present in Greek narratives. Persia was represented as a world of exotic luxuries, incomparable wealth, and extravagant customs. The Persians, according to the Greeks, were formidable warriors, but also given to hedonism, opulence, and dependence on their kings. This dual representation served to define the Greeks in opposition to their Oriental enemies, free against slaves, sober against indulgent, small but courageous against gigantic but corrupt. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore how these representations were molded by the political context. The medical wars left deep scars in the Greek imaginary, and the memory of Persia was used both to inspire pride and to justify the military and cultural expansion of Greece. The victory in Marathon, Salamina, and Plataea became a founding myth that cemented the idea of Hellenic superiority. However, as time advanced and Greek city-states fell under the domain of Alexander the Great, the borders between Greek and Persian began to blur. Later historians, like Plutarch, look back with a more nuanced perspective, recognizing both conflicts and mutual influences. Persia ceased to be the defeated enemy and became an integral part of the historical narrative that defined the ancient world. In the words that the Greeks dedicated to Persia, there is a testimony of their own complexity. Although texts may seem judicious or even biased, they also reveal a deep fascination with an empire that, in many ways, was as admirable as feared. Persia not only lived in Greek memory as an adversary, he also persisted as a reminder of ambition, greatness, and lessons of shared history. In the echo of the centuries, when the dust seemed to have buried the glories of the past, Persia resurfaced with a renewed force under the banner of the Sassanids. This new empire, which rose in the 3rd century AD, not only claimed the legacy of the ancient affliction, but also sought to restore the spirit of greatness that once defined the land of Cyrus el Grande and Darius I. In every corner of their vast territory, the Sassanids wove a pure eye between the ancient and the modern, between the lost glory and the promise of an eternal future. When Arashir I, the founder of the Sassanid dynasty, defeated the last childbirth, Artaban V, his gaze was not only put in the present. In his mind, he vibrated the memory of the Achaemenids, those giants of antiquity that the first truly global empire had built. For Arashir, Persia should not simply be a kingdom among others, it must be the incarnation of divine justice, the center of world order, and the light of Ahura Mazda on earth. The symbolism of this rebirth was clear from the beginning. Ardashir and his successors adopted an iconography and language that directly evoked to those. Sassanid coins, for example, showed the kings with majestic crowns, surrounded by inscriptions that proclaimed their divinity and legitimacy, a practice inspired by the traditions coined centuries before. In the ceremonies, the Sassanids revived rituals that remembered the connection between the monarch and Ahura Mazda, reinforcing the idea that the king was not simply an earthly ruler, but the one chosen to maintain the cosmic balance. But the Sassanid resurgence was not limited to symbolic gestures. There was a tangible reconstruction of Persian power and culture that connected with the old inheritance. The cities flourished with an architecture that evoked the proportions and greatness of Persepolis, but adapted to a new era. The city of Ctesiphonte, with its famous Arch of Tak-Khazra, became the center of imperial power and a testimony of Persian engineering and art. This monument, with its imposing size and elegant design, seemed to murmur in the wind the eternal ambition of Persia to reach the sublime. Religion was also a key pillar in this connection with the past. Zoroastrism, which had been the spiritual soul of the Achaemenids, was restored and strengthened under the Sassanids. The sacred writings of the Osta were encoded, and the fire temples were centers of veneration and learning. The priests, known as magicians, played a fundamental role in the administration of the kingdom, guaranteeing that laws and policies were aligned with Zarathustra's teachings. This religious rebirth not only unified the empire, but also distinguished it against its neighbors, such as the Roman Empire, with whom the Sassanids maintained a fierce rivalry. The rivalry with Rome was another point of connection with the past. If the Achaemenids had fought against the Greeks, the Sassanids faced the Romans and, later, the Byzantines, in a conflict that defined the geopolitics of the region for centuries. The battles in territories such as Mesopotamia and Armenia were not only military clashes, but also clashes of civilizations. The Sassanids saw in Rome a distorted reflection of their own imperial ambition, a rival power that, like them, sought world supremacy. However, in these clashes, Persia reaffirmed his role as a cultural and political counterweight, preserving his traditions against Western influence. The artistic legacy of the Sassanids also deeply drank from the Achaemenid roots. The reliefs carved in rock, such as those of Nakshi Rostam and Bishapu, narrate stories of military triumphs and divine alliances, evoking the images of the ancient Persian kings recorded on the walls of Persepolis. However, these reliefs are not mere imitations, they show refinement and evolution that reflect the adaptability and continuity of the Persian spirit. The administration of the Sassanid Empire, although adapted to the challenges of its time, also showed clear spoils. The decentralized governance system, with a network of local provinces and governors, remembered the old satrapia. In addition, the Sassanids promoted trade and infrastructure, revitalizing routes such as the Silk Route, which connected Persia with the rest of the world. This economic dynamism not only strengthened the empire, but also turned it into a bridge between the East and West, a position that had been the pride of the Achaemenids. However, Sassanid resurgence was not exempt from challenges. The internal tensions, the provincial rebellions, and the constant pressure of their external enemies tested the resilience of the empire. But even in adversity, the Sassanids kept Persia's flame alive. In his victories and defeats, in his temples and palaces, he resonated the voice of his ancestors, reminding them that his destiny was to bring the Persian legacy forward, beyond the shadows of time. In the twilight of the Sassanid Empire, when the winds of history brought new forces and cultures, the spirit of Persia did not disappear. The connection between the Achaemenids and the Sassanids was not only a matter of blood or territory, but of an immortal idea, that Persia, in all its complexity and beauty, was more than an empire. It was a symbol of resistance, creativity, and eternal greatness. When you think about an empire that transcended the borders of time, the Persian Empire stands out not only for its military achievements or its cultural splendor, but also because of its innovative governance approach. Throughout history, the Persians managed to administer a vast territory that extended from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, a diverse empire with dozens of different peoples, religions, and languages. However, the key to its longevity and success did not reside solely in the strength of its army, but in the cunning and wisdom with which they structured their political system. At a time when the known world was still governed by small kingdoms and tribal cacicazgos, the Persians adopted an administrative organization that allowed not only the expansion of their power, but its consolidation. Under the Achaemenid dynasty, the creation of satrapia was a revolutionary example of decentralization that allowed the Persian Empire to cover an unprecedented extension and, at the same time, maintain efficient control over its vast territories. Each satrapia was an autonomous administrative unit, governed by a satrap, who was responsible for both the security and economic well-being of his region. However, this power was balanced by a centralized supervision system. The satraps were not only chosen according to their loyalty to the king, but also assigned inspectors known as the king's eyes, who monitored the activities of the satrapas to ensure that they did not abuse their authority. This system combined autonomy with supervision, allowing a balance between the central and premises that became a reference for subsequent political systems. In addition, the Persians introduced a pragmatic and humanistic vision in their relationships with the conquered populations. While other empires adopted policies of repression and forced assimilation, the Persian Empire adopted a strategy of respect for local customs, which allowed them to gain the loyalty of peoples as diverse as the Egyptians, Babylonians, Jews, or Greeks. By allowing them to conserve their traditions, religions, and social structures, Persia not only avoided rebellions, but also facilitated the integration of these peoples into their imperial system. The use of Aramaic as a frank language of the empire was another essential aspect of the Persian governance system. By promoting a common language for communication between diverse cultures, the Persians created a network that facilitated both trade and administration. This linguistic approach favored the cohesion of the empire and allowed a better circulation of ideas, goods, and people, something that became a pillar of its success. The development of an efficient infrastructure, with a road network that connected all satrapia, was another of the outstanding achievements. The Persians not only built paths that facilitated the transport of troops, but also created a fast messaging system that allowed communication between the various corners of the empire in times of war and peace. This network not only promoted political stability, but also promoted trade and economic prosperity throughout the empire. A fundamental aspect of the Persian governance model was his focus on justice. Persian law was known for its impartiality and respect for local traditions. Each region had its own courts, but the king maintained control over the most important decisions. In the inscriptions of the Persian kings, such as those of Cyrus el Grande, you can see how the idea that the Persian rulers were protectors of law and justice is underlined. The treatment of conquered peoples also reflected this ideal. Cyrus, for example, is remembered for their benevolent treatment with the Jews exiled in Babylon, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act that was seen as an example of justice that endures to this day. This idea of a fair and benevolent government, in which the king presented himself as the protector of the peoples and defender of order, became a model for future empires, from the Roman Empire to the Islamic Empire. Even the ideas of the European monarchs of the Middle Ages, such as the notion of the divine law of the kings, have their roots in the way in which the Persian monarchs were perceived as agents of the divine will on the earth. However, the Persian governance model was not exempt from difficulties. The enormous extension of the empire, cultural differences, and constant external threats tested their stability. To its length of the centuries, internal tensions and external invasions were gradually crumbling the foundations of the powerful Persian structure. But despite his fall, the legacy of his administration lasted and left an indelible mark on history. The Persian model deeply influenced the evolution of government structures worldwide. The Romans, for example, borrowed many elements of the Persian system, especially with regard to the organization of provinces and infrastructure. As the Persian Empire disintegrated under the invasions of Alexander the Great, the ideas that had thrown under the Achaemenids and the Sassanids continued alive in the collective memory of humanity. At present, modern political systems, from Western democracies to constitutional monarchies, find in the Persian model a source of inspiration regarding efficient administration, respect for cultural diversity, and the importance of infrastructure in the cohesion of a territory. Although circumstances have changed and the historical context is very different, the principle that an empire must balance centralization with local autonomy remains a relevant issue in discussions on governance and administration. Thus, the Persian Empire, through its pragmatic vision of politics, stands as a model of how a centralized administration can coexist harmoniously with the diversity of peoples, languages, and religions. The Persian administration, with its ability to integrate and govern vast territories, continues to be a lighthouse of wisdom for those who seek to understand the complexities of governing an empire in a world full of contrasts. In the vast scenario of ancient history, the great empires faced each other, not only in battles, but in the ability to leave an indelible brand in humanity. Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and Persia, each in its own way, defined the rules of power and civilization in their time. However, the way in which each of these empires approached governance, culture, and expansion varied considerably. Persia, with its vast extension and extraordinary influence, stood out for its unique approach, a model that compared and, in many ways, contrasted with that of the other superpowers of antiquity. Egypt, one of the oldest civilizations in the world, was based on a rigid hierarchical structure, with Pharaoh as a divine and infallible being. Unlike Persia, where the monarch was seen as a protector and administrator of divine justice, the Egyptian pharaoh was considered the very incarnation of the gods on earth. His power was absolute and was based on a direct relationship with the divine pantheon. This centralization of power contrasted with the Persian model, where, although the king was a central figure, the administration was decentralized through satrapia, which allowed the regions greater autonomy. While Egypt stood out in his architectural monumentality and his religious legacy, Persia shone in his ability to govern a multi-ethnic and multicultural empire. Egypt, with its conservative traditions, remained relatively isolated, while Persia, under the Achaemenids, adopted an inclusive approach to conquered peoples, allowing the preservation of their local cultures, religions, and laws. This undoubtedly contributed to the stability of the Persian Empire for centuries, while Egypt often suffered due to the lack of a flexible structure to internal tensions and foreign invasions. Greece, meanwhile, represented a radical contrast with Persia. While Persia was a centralized and vast empire, Greece was defined by its independent city-states, each with its own government system. Athens, for example, was a democracy, while Sparta was governed by a militaristic oligarchy. The Greek capacity to generate philosophical thinking, art, and science was unsurpassed, and its influence on Western culture endures to this day. However, Greece lacked the political and territorial unity that Persia possessed. The Persians, with their administrative unit and their pragmatic approach to govern, managed to integrate vast regions under the same political system, while Greek city-states, although powerful, often crumbled under internal struggles. The famous war between Persia and Greece, which culminated in medical wars, evidenced the differences between the two empires. The Greeks, despite their relative lack of unity, managed to resist and finally repel the Persian invasion. This Greek victory, however, did not reduce the Persian model, which had still proven to be efficient on a large scale. Persia, on the other hand, continued to be a formidable power in the region, with an administrative structure that the Greeks could not match. Instead of depending on the will of a city-state, Persia relied on a territorial control system that allowed him to mobilize resources and maintain internal stability. Rome, the next great empire that rose after the fall of Persia, was deeply inspired by the Persian model. While Rome distanced himself from Persian monarchical traditions, he adopted many of the ideas of administrative governance that had been implemented by the Achaemenids. The Roman provinces, such as Persian satrapia, enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy under local governors, although the Romans maintained more direct control over key resources and decisions. The Roman organization, however, was much more militarized and aggressive than Persian, which preferred diplomacy and cultural integration to maintain control. The Romans also adopted the idea of a road network and an efficient messaging system, just like the Persians had done it centuries before. But Rome focused more on aggressive expansion and military domain, while Persia preferred internal stability and long-term management. Persian influence in Rome is evident in its administrative structures and in the way they handled the diverse cultures within their empire. Finally, the Chinese civilization, which developed in parallel to the Persian Empire, also shared some significant similarities and differences. While Persia focused on the integration of different peoples through a flexible and respectful political system with diversity, China, under the Qin and Han dynasties, was characterized by its most centralized approach and its rigid bureaucracy system. The Chinese political vision was much more uniform in cultural and social terms, compared to the religious and linguistic diversity that Persia encouraged. However, both China and Persia shared the same ability to create vast empires governed efficiently. Chinese emperors and Persian kings were seen as almost divine figures, although the Persians adopted a more inclusive approach to the conquered peoples, allowing greater autonomy and preservation of local customs. The stability of both empires depended largely on their ability to integrate different peoples and maintain order, but while China emphasized cultural homogenization, Persia embraced diversity. Each of these empires, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and Persia, left an indelible mark on history, but Persia stood out for its ability to handle an empire of such magnitude with an inclusive and flexible political approach. Its governance model, which balanced the central authority with local autonomy, not only served as an example for future empires, but also provided a base on which many of the administrative structures of the Western and Eastern world were built. The history of Persia, in its interactions with other great civilizations, reminds us that, in politics, as in history, true greatness is not only measured by the conquered territory, but by the ability to govern and unite a diversity of peoples under the same ideal. Persia's vision over the centuries has been a complex history of transformation, from a venerated power to an empire whose image was distorted by multiple narratives. This historiographic evolution reflects the changing perceptions of Persia, both in its days of glory and after its fall, depending on the political dynamics, cultural rivalries, and interpretations of the historians of each era. In his early days, during the apogee of the Achaemenid Empire, Persia was seen as a civilized, prosperous, and admirable superpower. For the ancient cultures that lived with Persia, especially in the Hellenic world, the Persian Empire was a reference of power and sophistication. Herodotus' Greek stories, in particular, offer a detailed vision of the Persian Empire. Aunque Herodoto no occulto las valencias del gobierno persa, como las tensiones internas y las excentricidades de ciertos monarcas, reconoció la grandeza del imperio, su organización administrativa y la diversidad que englobaba. For the Greeks, Persia was both a formidable rival as a culture worthy of admiration for their achievements and structure. However, Persia's perception began to change when the empire was defeated by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. The Greek account of the fall of Persia, embodied in the work of historians such as Plutarch and Arriano, went from being a story of glory to a decay. The figure of Dario III, the last Achaemenid monarch, was portrayed as a weak leader, unable to defend his vast empire against Alejandro's military power. This narrative of decay and fall was exploited for Greek historians to highlight the superiority of Hellenic culture over Persian. In the following centuries, with the expansion of the Roman Empire and the influence of Greco-Roman culture, Persia often was seen as an adversary of the past. For a long time, the Romans considered the Persians as a threat, as evidenced by the series of Roman-Persian wars that characterized the relations between the two empires. Despite this, Persian culture remained a fundamental component in the interactions between Rome and Persia, and many elements of the Persian political and administrative organization were adopted by the Romans. In the Middle Ages, with the ascension of the Sassanid Empire, Persia's vision suffered a modification. The Sassanid dynasty revived many of the Achaemenid practices and traditions, but also stood out for its approach to Zoroastrism and its continuous confrontation with the Roman Empire and, subsequently, the Byzantine Empire. In this context, Persia's vision changed to a rival power, but also of a civilization that fought for his survival. However, European historiography of the Middle Ages often relegated Persian history to the background in the face of the prominence of Mediterranean cultures and religious struggles between Christians and Muslims. The rebirth of interest in Persia came with the rise of historical research in the 19th century, largely as part of the general interest in ancient civilizations. Archaeology and epigraphy revealed the greatness of Persian cities, especially the impressive pursuit, and historians began to recognize the importance of Persia not only as a military empire, but also as a model of administration and culture. During this period, the approach began to move away from the simplistic and decadent visions of Persia who had established themselves in the Greek and Roman stories, and the Persian Empire began to be seen as an advanced civilization, whose contributions to humanity were fundamental, since its administrative policy until its artistic and architectural achievements. With the arrival of the 20th century and the modernization of historical studies, Persia's vision was even more enriched. In this period, studies on Zoroastrism and Persian religion acquired relevance, and a more nuanced understanding about the cultural legacy of the Persians began to forge. Historians, archaeologists, and experts in ancient languages have contributed to the rescue of Persian history, not only in the context of their clashes with the great civilizations of antiquity, but also as a culture that deeply influenced later religions and philosophies, especially in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, Persia's perception was not only academic. Throughout history, politics and geopolitical conflicts have influenced how Persian legacy is interpreted. During the 20th century, especially after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Persia's perspective became the figure of Iran, a country whose leaders and politicians have played a fundamental role in redefining the vision of their own history. The tense relationship with the West, added to the reinterpretation of the Persian imperial past, added a new layer of complexity to Persian historiography. Today, Persia studies not only focus on their military achievements or their complex relations with other civilizations, but also address the ways in which their cultural, political, and religious legacy has endured over time. The ancient Persia is no longer seen only through the lens of its rivals, but as a civilization that left a lasting mark in the world. What was once considered a decadent or mysterious empire, today is seen in a new light, that of an empire that, although defeated on the battlefield, managed to create an administrative, legal, and religious culture that has deeply influenced the world history. Persia's vision, therefore, has evolved from being seen as an enemy to be understood as one of the greatest and most complex civilizations of antiquity, whose impact continues to resonate in the present. The history and myths of Persia are full of powerful and complex female figures that, over the centuries, have played a fundamental role in both politics and religion and culture. In spite of the limitations that the Persian society of antiquity imposed on women, the historical and mythological stories show how these figures transcended those barriers, leaving a lasting mark on Persian thought and narrative. From Queen Esther to the mythical goddesses as Ard-vi-Sura on Ahita, the female figure in Persia was not just a passive presence. On the contrary, he was in the center of the story's more ifnificational, highlighting by its strength, wisdom, and ability to influence the destiny of nations. In the Bible, Queen Esther emerges as a key figure, whose courage and determination saved the Jewish people from annihilation in the Persian Empire. The history of Esther, although written in a religious and biblical context, reflects the power that a woman could exercise in the Persian court. Esther, a young Jew that becomes the wife of King Ahasuerus, not only captivated the monarch with her beauty, but also showed an amazing political cunning. When risking his life, he appeared before the king to intercede for his people, managing to change the fate of the Jews in Persia. In this story, Esther is not simply a passive figure, it is the heroine that, with intelligence and courage, assumes control of their own destiny and the destiny of its community. Its history highlights the power of women in the Persian court, although in an indirect and reserved way, showing that women could play crucial roles, even in an empire dominated by men. Beyond historical figures such as Esther, Persian mythology offers an even more rich vision of the role of women. The ancient Persian beliefs, especially Zoroastrism, worshipped several powerful goddesses, and the female figure in myths was not limited to secondary or submissive roles. One of the most important goddesses in Persian mythology is Ard-vi-Sura on Ahita, one of the most revered divinities of the Zoroastrian pantheon. On Ahita, the goddess of waters, fertility, and wisdom, represents not only the vital force of nature, but also the feminine ability to influence the health and well-being of the earth and its inhabitants. As a goddess of purity and fertility, Anahita was also considered a warrior, a deity that defended justice and peace. His cult was extremely popular, especially in the cities of Persia, where temples dedicated to their worship were built. Anahita's image as a goddess of power and action was far from the traditional representations of passive women. She was an active figure, who had the ability to influence human and heavenly affairs. The presence of women with such fundamental roles in religion and myths also reflected their ability to influence politics and culture. Although women in the Persian Empire, especially during the Achaemenid era, were mostly excluded from the circles of power, the stories of figures such as Esther or Anahita showed how the female figure could be essential, either through direct politics or through the symbolic and religious power. These women played leadership and protection roles, acting as guardians of collective well-being and representatives of justice and morality. In the courts of the Persian monarchs, women also had an important role, although they often went unnoticed by historians. The wives and concubines of the kings, although often relegated to a secondary role in the historical narrative, sometimes exerted an enormous political influence. It is known that some Persian queens, such as Cyrus el Grande's wife, had a significant influence on the political decisions of the empire, although they have not always been given the right credit in historical stories. One of the most prominent female figures in Persian history was, without a doubt, Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus el Grande and wife of Dario I. Atossa not only had a prominent role in the Persian court, but also won a place in history as one of the most powerful women in the empire. His figure is a clear example of how women, although they often did not occupy power, could be involved in the great events and decisions that defined the course of the empire. Atossa played an important role in Persia's internal and external policy, and its influence on the Persian court was unquestionable. The contrast between the female figures in history and the Persian myths is revealing. While mythological women like Anahita were active divinities that mold the destiny of the world, historical women were often key pieces in the politics and culture of the empire, although your contribution is less visible. Persian society, no matter how much it recognized the power and importance of women in myths and legends, often limited their influence on political practice. Despite these limitations, Persian women remained central figures, whose roles were fundamental for the stability and well-being of the empire. The history and mythology of Persia, therefore, offer a complex image of the role of women, which covers from the almighty goddess to the queen who, with subtlety and cunning, managed to influence the political decisions that would define the fate of her nation. Although Persian society limits the opportunities of women, both in the public and private sphere, Persian women, either in myths or in history, demonstrated their ability to act as figures of power, love, justice, and wisdom, leaving a mark deep in the very heart of Persian civilization. The Greco-Persian Wars, which marked one of the most emblematic confrontations between two of the most influential civilizations of antiquity, have been a constant source of inspiration in modern culture. Over the centuries, these conflicts have been represented in various ways in literature, cinema, and politics, transforming into symbols of struggle, resistance, and the clash of civilizations. The images of gigantic Persian armies marching towards the Greek coast, facing the small but brave Hellenic forces, continue to resonate in popular culture, sometimes deeply idealized and other times distorted. Through these representations, the Greco-Persian Wars not only remain a theme of historical fascination, but have become a reflection of contemporary tensions and the continuous interaction between cultures. One of the most notable representations of Greco-Persian Wars in modern culture comes from literature. From the writings of ancient historians such as Herodotus, who offered one of the most complete stories of wars in his work Stories, to the epic dramas of modern authors, the Greco-Persian Wars have been a fertile field for literary interpretation. In the works of Herodotus, Persia appears as an overwhelming power, but also as a civilization that, in his pride, makes mistakes that lead to his fall against the cunning and courage of the Greeks. However, in modern literature, this narrative has clarified several times, showing not only the struggle between two empires, but also the human dilemmas involved, the value against fear, fate against free will. In contemporary literature, Greco-Persian wars are often represented as a struggle between the East and the West, an issue that is explored in philosophical, political, and cultural terms. In many modern narratives, the Persians are seen as the other, a different civilization, sometimes cruel, oppressive and excessive, that faces the Greeks, who are represented as the defenders of freedom, democracy and individualism. This contrast has been especially evident in the representation of figures such as Xerxes I, the Persian king who led the invasion of Greece. In modern literature, Xerxes is usually portrayed as an arrogant villain who, despite his power, fails to defeat the little but certain Greece. In some cases, as in the famous play of Aeschylus, Los Persars, written in the 5th century BC, presents the Persians as victims of their own imperialist ambition, while the Greeks are exalted by their heroic resistance. Modern cinema has been a powerful medium for the representation of Greco-Persian wars, especially with the rise of action movies and historical epic. One of the most influential films in the contemporary representation of these wars is 300, directed by Zack Snyder in 2006. Based on Frank Miller's comic, 300 portrays the famous Battle of the Thermopyles, in which a small army from Spartans, led by King Leonidas, he faces the gigantic Persian invasion. The film offers a stylized and dramatic version of the battle, with emphasis on the courage and the sacrifice of the Spartans, while it presents the Persians as a gloomy and dehumanized crowd, led by an extravagant and cruel-looking Xerxes. Although 300 is not a historically exact portrait, its impact on popular culture has been enormous, and has influenced how these ancient wars are perceived in the collective imaginary, especially in its simplification of the conflict as an epic battle between good, Greece, and evil, Persia. However, the representation of the Greco-Persian wars in modern cinema is not limited to a one-dimensional vision. In other films, such as The Last King of Scotland, or cinematographic productions about Alexander the Great, the complexities of the Persian characters are explored, showing that the story is not divided between good and bad. In these stories, Persia appears not only as an enemy to defeat, but also as an advanced civilization with a rich culture and a deep sense of justice. In fact, the most nuanced vision of Persia in modern cinema has contributed to a re-evaluation of its importance in world history, going from being a simple antagonist in Greek stories to a civilization that also deserves recognition for its cultural contributions, policy casts, and philosophical. Beyond cinema and literature, Greco-Persian wars have been used in politics to represent the struggle between civilizations and the clash of values. In the modern age and the contemporary era, politicians and leaders have evoked the Greco-Persian wars to illustrate conflicts between West and Orient. In this context, the figure of Persia has been used in speeches about imperialism, nationalism, and cultural identity. During the Cold War, for example, some Western leaders presented to the struggle between Greece and Persia as an allegory of the confrontation between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union, suggesting that, like the Greeks, they faced a powerful Persia, the West owed resist the threat of Oriental communism. In more recent times, tensions between the West and Iran have revived this metaphor, with some observers and politicians comparing contemporary tensions with the old clash between the two civilizations. The representation of the Greco-Persian wars, from literature to cinema and politics, shows how ancient conflicts remain relevant in modern culture. These wars are not only distant historical events, but have become powerful symbols that continue to be reinterpreted and recontextualized to respond to the needs and tensions of the present. In modern culture, the figures of the Greek heroes and the great Persian kings, epic battles and power struggles, remain an inexhaustible source of inspiration, reflection, and debate about identities, civilizations, and conflicts that define our world current. Cyrus el Grande, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, left a legacy that continues to resonate in the modern world, especially with regard to human rights and politics. His vision of an empire based on respect for the cultures and religions of their conquered peoples was advanced to their time, providing a model of tolerant governance that influenced the development of ideas that today are essential in the political sphere and in fundamental rights of people. Although the modern world has experienced immense transformations since the time of Cyrus, its principles remain a crucial reference in contemporary politics, both in terms of respect for diversity and the protection of individual freedoms. One of the most transcendent aspects of Cyrus el Grande's legacy is his approach to the rights of the peoples he conquered. Unlike other conquerors of his time, Cyrus did not seek forced assimilation or the destruction of cultures that fell under his domain. His policy of respect for the traditions, religions, and customs of the conquered regions allowed him to consolidate a vast and diverse empire without resorting to oppression or brutal imposition. The Cylinder of Cyrus, an inscription in stone discovered in Babylon in 1879, is one of the most important documents that illustrates his vision. In this text, Cyrus proclaims their policy of religious tolerance, allowing exiled peoples, such as Jews, to return to their lands and restore their temples. This act, in itself, marked a precedent in the idea of religious freedom and respect for cultural identities, principles that would materialize centuries later in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. The notion of respect for foreign beliefs and customs is a principle that has endured to this day in international laws. Cyrus's vision of a tolerant empire, which did not subject its subjects to a single culture or religion, can be seen as a precursor to the modern idea of human rights, in which dignity and inalienable rights of all people are recognized, regardless of race, religion, or culture. This policy of respect and empathy towards differences is present in numerous international constitutions and treaties, which advocate religious freedom, self-determination of peoples, and equal rights. Cyrus also promoted an administrative system that allowed a decentralized structure, in which satraps, provincial governors, managed the territories autonomously, but under the supervision of the monarch. This system, although imperialist in its nature, favored stability and allowed the various regions of the empire to preserve a degree of autonomy. This administrative structure, which balanced centralized control with respect for local peculiarities, has also influenced modern forms of political organization. Many of the current nations adopt federal or decentralized systems, in which the provinces or regions enjoy a certain degree of autonomy, similar to the model that Cyrus implemented in his empire. This equitable governance approach has been a basis for the development of many contemporary democratic nations. In political terms, Cyrus' legacy can be seen in the way in which current world powers handle diplomacy and international relations. Cyrus was a pioneer in international diplomacy, and his empire was one of the first to recognize the importance of negotiation and mutual respect between nations. Through his policy of respect for the conquered peoples, Cyrus established a diplomatic practice that transcended the simple act of the conquest. In fact, Cyrus is considered by many as a precursor to modern diplomacy, since he favored mutual understanding and strategic alliances, instead of constant war. This pragmatic vision of international politics is still in force today, especially in the field of foreign relations, where negotiation and respect for the interests of other nations are essential for global peace and stability. On the other hand, the respect of Cyrus for individual freedoms is also reflected in modern justice systems. The idea that all peoples, regardless of their origin or religion, should have the opportunity to live in peace and prosperity, laid the foundations for the future evolution of legal systems. In his domains, Cyrus promoted the establishment of laws that were fair and protected the rights of their subjects, which is considered one of the first attempts to create a legal structure that protects the individual from the arbitrariness of power. This approach to justice has influenced the development of modern legal constitutions and systems, in which the right to a fair trial, equality before law and abuse protection are considered fundamental principles. The impact of Cyrus el Grande is also evident in the way in which modern nations address the issue of human rights. Although his empire was not characterized by a democratic model, the religious and cultural tolerance that Cyrus promoted in his time was an important step towards the conception of universal human rights. Through its actions, Cyrus showed that an empire does not have to be oppressive to be great, and that respect for cultural and religious differences can be an engine of unity and prosperity. In the contemporary context, the figure of Cyrus has been seen as a symbol of justice and humanity in politics. Its legacy remains relevant in the debate on the rights of minorities, religious freedom, and the importance of self-determination. The principles that he defended more than 2,000 years ago are still a guide for modern leaders seeking a balance between central power and respect for the various identities within a nation. In short, the legacy of Cyrus el Grande not only lasts in history, but also continues to influence human politics and rights in the contemporary world, serving as a reminder that the greatness of a nation is not measured only by its military power, but for its ability to promote peace, justice, and tolerance. Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Persian Empire, erected under the mandate of Darius I, represents one of the most impressive architectural achievements of antiquity. Beyond its function as an administrative and ceremonial headquarters of the empire, the city stands as a testimony of majesty, innovation, and vision of Persian architects. Its architecture not only reflects the power and greatness of the Achaemenid Empire, but has also influenced later generations, leaving a lasting impact on world history. The magnificence of their structures, the intricate details of their sculptures, and the sophistication of their urban planning are still subject to admiration and study, both in their historical context and in the influences it has had in modern architecture. The construction of Persepolis began around 518 BC. Under the reign of Darius I and continued under his successors, including Xerxes I and Artaxerxes Ramat, not only provided an impressive view, but also reflected the symbolism of divine greatness. Persepolis's architecture was a masterpiece of engineering, showing unique symbiosis between the structures constructed by the human being and the surrounding nature. The city was protected by a series of walls and gates, and their palaces, temples, and squares were testimony of the wealth and cultural diversity of the Persian Empire. The most outstanding thing about Persepolis's architecture is its innovative use of materials and construction techniques. The ancient Persians took advantage of the local limestone to build the majestic structures, and the facades of the buildings were adorned with sculpted details that represented scenes of everyday life, the court of the king, as well as mythological figures. The reliefs, such as those found on the staircase of the embassies, show a fusion of the different cultures that formed the Persian Empire, with representations of people of various ethnicities, which underlines the cosmopolitan character and the religious tolerance of the empire. The Dario Palace, the Apadana Palace, and the Hall of 140 Columns are just some of the best-known examples of architectural greatness that defined the city. Persepolis' structure was also designed to reflect the hierarchy and order of the Persian Empire. Each element, from the monumental door to the columns that supported the roofs of the palaces, was designed to transmit a message of power and authority. The huge columns, which some came to measure up to 20 meters high, and the great stairs were fundamental elements of this visual communication, aimed at impressing visitors who arrived from various parts of the empire. The combination of elegance, power, and functionality in Persepolis architecture not only demonstrated the technical domain of the Persians, but also symbolized the monarch's ideal as an intermediary between the gods and men. However, Persepolis' splendor did not last forever. In 330 BC, the city was looted and destroyed by the Alexander the Great army, which meant a devastating blow to the Persian Empire. Despite the subsequent efforts to preserve the ruins, Persepolis fell into oblivion for centuries, and their monuments were reduced to debris. It was only in the 20th century when Persepolis' ruins were rediscovered and the restoration work began that, to this day, are still ongoing. The restoration of Persepolis has been a monumental company that has involved archaeologists, architects, and historians around the world. The conservation process has not only focused on the reconstruction of physical structures, but also on the preservation of the artistic and sculptural details that make the city a work of art itself. However, the restoration of Persepolis has been a considerable challenge, since, due to its partial destruction, the original materials have been difficult to find and rebuild. Despite these obstacles, it has been possible to maintain the essence of the city and offer the world a vision of the magnificence it once had. The influence of Persepolis' architecture extends far beyond its own walls. For centuries, architects and designers around the world have been inspired by Persepolis' forms and designs. The architectural elements of the city, such as Persian columns, impressive stairs, and monumental doors, have left a mark on Islamic architecture, in particular, and have also influenced the rebirth of neoclassicism in Europe. The grandiosity of Persepolis structures is reflected in the European palaces of the modern age, in the construction of large public buildings, and in the design of monuments dedicated to imperial power. The influence of the columns and the sculpted decorations of Persepolis has been integrated into modern architecture, and their designs continue to be an aesthetic reference worldwide. The concept of monumentality and power expressed in the architecture of Persepolis has also been a source of inspiration for modern public architecture, where massive structures and great designs continue to be used to transmit authority, as in government buildings and commemorative monuments. In addition, the integration of architecture with the landscape, which the Persians achieved so effectively when building Persepolis in an impressive natural environment, has been adopted in many modern architectural projects that seek a harmony between the built and the surrounding environment. Today, Persepolis remains one of the most valuable assets of humanity, not only as an archaeological wonder, but as an enduring testimony of creativity, power, and wisdom of the ancient Persians. Through its modern restoration, this architectural jewel not only connects us with the past, but continues to influence the way we understand architecture, art, and power. The magnificence of Persepolis, although reduced to ruins, continues to inspire those who study it, reminding us that architecture, beyond its practical function, has the power to tell stories, reflect cultures, and leave an indelible brand in the history of humanity. Zoroastrism, one of the world's oldest religions, has left a deep legacy that resonates even today. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, in ancient Persia, around the 6th century BC, this monotheistic faith not only marked an era of religious transformation in its time, but its principles remain essential for modern Zoroastric communities, although they are much less numerous today. Zoroastrism, with its emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, the purity of fire and the importance of morality, has not only influenced other religions over the centuries, but also has a significant impact on the life of his followers, many of which reside in communities scattered throughout the world, especially in Iran, India, and parts of the diaspora. Although Zoroastrism was one of the predominant religions in the Persian Empire for several centuries, its influence was not limited only to the religious sphere. Zoroastric principles on good, evil, and moral responsibility had a deep impact on other beliefs, particularly in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, the decline of the Persian Empire, Arab invasions, and massive conversion to Islam made Zoroastrism begin to decline. Despite this decrease, Zoroaster's legacy is still alive in the faith and customs of current Zoroastric communities. The main community of Zoroastrics is currently in India, known as the Parsis. This group of followers emigrated to India from Persia, Iran, during the Muslim invasion, seeking refuge and preserving their religion and culture. Despite being a small community, the Parsis have maintained their religious traditions in a remarkable way. His religious practices revolve around respect for nature, the purity of fire, and belief in Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Fire temples, where sacred fires are maintained that never go out, remain places of worship and meditation, symbolizing the eternal presence of the divine. These temples are still a crucial spiritual center for Zoroastrics, both in their rituality and in the sense of community. Morality and Zoroastric ethics continue to be fundamental for modern Zoroastric. Good thought, good word, good fact, is one of the best-known slogans of this religion and summarizes the vision of the Zoroastric world, the importance of living with righteousness, of being responsible in daily decisions, and maintaining a life that reflects these principles in all actions. Throughout the centuries, these teachings have been transmitted through oral tradition and sacred texts, and remain an essential foundation for new generations of Zoroastric. At present, Zoroastric ethics is also reflected in the social and environmental initiatives of the community, especially in India, where the Parsis continue to demonstrate a firm commitment to the protection of the environment and social welfare. In the social field, modern Zoroastrism also faces challenges related to the preservation of their faith and cultural identity. Although the Zoroastrians have maintained an active community life in many parts of the world, their number has decreased due to migration, conversion to other religions, and the low birth rate within the community. In this context, contemporary Zoroastrism faces the pressure of maintaining its relevance in a globalized world, with culturalization and cultural homogenization trends. Zoroastric communities, both in Iran and in the diaspora, struggle to keep their traditions alive while interacting with more dominant cultures and religions. The community aspect of religion remains one of its cornerstones. Festivities such as the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and the Fireworks Festival, as well as other religious celebrations, are moments of unity and reaffirmation of Zoroastric identity. These celebrations, deeply connected with natural stations and cycles, not only maintain the cultural identity of Zoroastric, but also serve as an opportunity to reflect on the values of religion and its relevance in everyday life. One of the most significant contributions of contemporary Zoroastrism is its emphasis on preservation and respect for the environment. The Zoroaster religion promotes a deep vision of nature as sacred, where water, fire, and earth must be protected as manifestations of divinity. This respect for nature is reflected in the environmental efforts that Zoroastric, especially Parsis in India, have undertaken over the years. In many parts of the world, the Zoroastric are at the vanguard of initiatives to combat pollution and preserve natural resources. This ecological legacy is one of the aspects that remain relevant today, in a world increasingly concerned about global environmental challenges. In addition to its connection with nature, modern Zoroastrism has also committed to social progress. Faith emphasizes the importance of social justice, collective well-being, and charity, values that translate into concrete actions. Zoroastric communities have been involved in various humanitarian causes, particularly in the promotion of education, gender equality, and access to health. In fact, the Parsis have played a crucial role in the economic and social development of India, with prominent contributions in the business, educational, and cultural fields. Throughout the centuries, Zoroastrism has demonstrated a notable capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, maintaining its fundamental principles while evolving with times. Although Zoroastric are a religious minority today, its influence is still alive in the cultures and religions of the world, and its legacy continues to be a lighthouse of light in the search for truth, justice, and harmony. The relevance of Zoroastrismo today, both in the Zoroastric communities and in global society, is a testimony of the enduring power of a faith that emerged more than 2,000 years ago in the lands of Persia, and that continues to illuminate the path to a baser, equitable and sustainable future. Persia has captured the imagination of humanity for centuries. From ancient times to the modern era, the rich history, myths and the majesty of the Persian Empire have left a deep mark on literature, cinema and video games. This fascination is not only the reflection of a powerful and mystical civilization, but also an open door to a world full of wonders, legends, and a deeply influential culture. The figure of Persia, with its mixture of exoticism, ancestral wisdom, and epic conquests, has been reinterpreted again and again in the most popular art forms, creating a legacy that is still alive today. In literature, Persia has always been an issue that has stimulated the creativity of writers and poets. From the epic stories of ancient Persia, such as the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, which tells the mythological history of the Persian kings, to the modern works that explore life in the Persian Empire, the writers have sought to capture the essence of this ancient Old One empire. This epic poem, considered one of the most important in Persian literature, has been a source of inspiration for many Western authors and has been adapted in various ways. Works such as The 1001 Nights, which although it is not an exclusively Persian work, include stories that develop in the context of the ancient Persian Empire, have helped build a romantic and mysterious vision of Persia. In contemporary literature, the approach to Persia is not always historical, but also symbolic. Writers like Michael Moorcock, with his fantasy series The Cycle of Elric de Melnibone, have incorporated influences of ancient Persia in their fictitious worlds. In these stories, Persia and their cultural elements are transformed into mystical landscapes full of magic, betrayals and epic destinations. Also, in travel literature, authors such as Wilfrid Scoran Blunt and Robert Byron have left fascinating stories about their explorations of Persia, immortalizing the country as a place of mystery and astonishment. The cinema, meanwhile, has been one of the most powerful art forms to project the image of Persia in popular imagination. Persia representations in the cinema have oscillated between the glorification of its greatness and the exaggeration of their excesses. One of the most influential films in this regard is The 300, directed by Zack Snyder, based on the famous Battle of Thermopylae between the Spartans and the Persian army. Although the film takes some artistic licenses, the figure of Dario I as the Persian king and the representation of his empire as an unstoppable military machinery have been recorded in the mind of the public. The figure of the Persian king is presented in an almost mythical, imposing and fearsome way, which highlights the perception of Persia as a formidable military power. Another famous film that has contributed to the modern image of Persia is Prince of Persia, Las Arenas del Tiempo. This film, based on a popular video game, not only presents the story of a Persian prince who must save his kingdom, but also highlights the fascination with Persian aesthetics, the intricate palaces, the traffic plots and the arid and majestic landscape of the desert. Through special effects and an adventure narrative, Prince of Persia has achieved the culture and mystical elements of Persia to a global audience, mixing history with fantasy in a modern context. In the most historical cinematography, films such as Alexander the Great of Oliver Stone also explore the relationship between Persia and Greece in the medical wars and the invasion of Alexander the Great. The representation of the great Persian armies, the majesty of the court and the figure of the Persian monarch, Xerxes I, contributes to the continuous fascination by Persia on the big screen. The impact of Persia does not stop on the cinema, but has also infiltrated the world of video games. Prince of Persia, an action and adventure video game developed by Jordan Mechner in the 80s, has been one of the most successful franchises that has led Persia to the digital world. Throughout the different deliveries of the saga, the players assume the role of a Persian prince who fights dark forces and exceeds challenges through agility, struggle, and cunning. The game has played a fundamental role in keeping the fascination with ancient Persia alive, presenting to the players a vibrant world, full of golden palaces, intricate dungeons, and desert scenarios. The saga has contributed to perpetuating the image of an ancient empire full of secrets, adventures, and mysteries. At present, video games continue to explore the cultural wealth of Persia in titles that transport the player to worlds inspired by Persian antiquity. Games like Assassin's Creed, Origins, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider allusions to the ancient civilizations of Persia and their enemies, adding to the narrative complexity and emotion. Through these games, players not only explore the vast world of the Persian Empire, but also immerse themselves in the culture, politics, and struggle for the power of this fascinating civilization. Over the centuries, Persia has left an indelible brand in popular culture. Whether through the great historical deeds, the legends that surround figures such as Cyrus el Grande or Dario, or the magic and mysticism of their mythology, Persia continues to be a symbol of mystery, greatness, and conflict in collective imagination. This power of attraction is the will of a civilization that, despite having fallen, remains a source of inspiration for literature, cinema, video games, and any means that seeks to represent the sublime, epic, and the eternal. The Persian Empire, the first true superpower of the ancient world, left an indelible mark on global history. His influence transcended the borders of his vast territory and penetrated deeply into the cultures and civilizations with which he came into contact. Throughout the centuries, Persia was not only synonymous with military power and territorial expansion, but also of wisdom, administrative organization, and cultural wealth. His legacy lasts not only in the monuments and cities that they built, but also in political systems, religious ideas, and ethical principles that continue to influence the modern world. Persia's greatness did not lie solely in his ability to conquer, but in his ability to integrate and respect the cultures he found in his path. It was an empire that promoted religious and cultural tolerance, an advanced notion for its time, and established an efficient government system that would inspire future nations. The figure of Cyrus el Grande, in particular, symbolizes the ideals of justice and humanity that guided the empire, leaving a legacy that still resonates in democratic values and contemporary human rights. The impact of Persia is also reflected in its contribution to world culture. Monumental architecture, advances in science, arts, and philosophy, along with its rich literary tradition, are wills with the sophistication of their civilization. From Zoroastrism to the Satrapia system that inspired administrative models worldwide, Persian influence was vast and lasting, laying the foundations for the future development of empires and states throughout Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. In addition, the Persian Empire did not limit itself to be a superpower of its time. Its impact lasts in collective memory, feeding popular imagination through literature, cinema, and other art forms. The fascination with Persia is still alive in contemporary culture, which underlines the relevance of its historical legacy today. Today, in a globalized world where cultural influences are mixed and transformed, the Persian Empire remains a source of inspiration and a reminder that power is not only measured in military force, but also in the ability to create a system just, promote peace, and respect cultural diversity. Persia, like the first superpower of the ancient world, not only changed the course of history, but being a reference for future generations that seek to learn from the achievements and lessons of the past.